He slammed the papers down so hard the ink, well tipped, and spilled black across the kitchen table like a wound. "Sign it," Victor Langford said, and his voice carried the kind of quiet that was worse than shouting. "Or else make sure every bank between here and Helena knows Blackridge Ranch is a bad investment." Gideon Mercer stared at the contract, 7,000 acres. His parents' life's work, his own, and he almost picked up the pen. That was the moment Mara Ellison stepped out of the kitchen doorway, flower still on her hands, eyes steady as a rifle sight, and said two words that changed everything. "Sign." If you've ever watched someone try to take everything from a person who had nothing left to lose, stay with me. Because this story isn't just about a ranch or a contract or even justice. It's about what happens when one woman decides that the same trap that destroyed her family will not destroy another. Before we go any further, if stories like this speak to you, please subscribe to this channel and hit that bell so you never miss what's coming next. Drop a comment and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I genuinely want to see how far this story travels. And if it moves you, hit that like button. It means more than you know. Now, let's go back to where it all began. The autumn of 1882 arrived in Montana Territory the way it always did, without asking permission and without apology. The grass on the eastern range turned the color of old copper. The sky went wide and pale and indifferent. And on the 7,000 acres of Blackridge Ranch, a man who owned more land than most men ever dreamed of, sat alone at a table that could seat 14 and ate cold biscuits for the third morning in a row. Gideon Mercer was 41 years old. He had the kind of face that had been handsome once and was now something better than handsome, weathered particular, with lines around his eyes that came from squinting into wind rather than from laughing. His hands were a working man's hands, despite the size of his holdings. He had built almost nothing with money alone. He had built it with those hands, with his father's stubbornness, and with a kind of focused grief that had been driving him forward for 6 years. His mother had gone first. His father, 8 months after. Neither death had been dramatic. That was the cruelest part. No storm, no accident, no villain. Just time and illness, and then silence where two voices used to be. After that, Gideon had done what men of his generation did when they didn't know what else to do with pain. He worked. He expanded. He added acreage when the grief got heavy, bought cattle when the loneliness pressed in too close. The ranch got bigger and the house got emptier, and at some point, those two facts had simply become the shape of his life. Fireplaces went cold. Not because wood was scarce. There was plenty, but because starting a fire for one person seemed like an argument that could never be won. The curtains in the east wing stayed closed, not because the windows were broken, but because what was the point of light if no one was going to remark on it? Kitchen, which his mother had kept fragrant and warm, had been reduced to a functional space where a rotating series of cook's helpers made meals that were edible and nothing more. Nobody stayed long. Nobody wanted to. By October of that year, Gideon had gone through 4 hired hands in the kitchen since spring, and 3 of them had quit without full notice. He didn't blame them. He wasn't an easy man to work for, not because he was cruel, he wasn't, but because the silence of that house had a weight to it. You could feel it the moment you walked through the door. Some people found it peaceful. Most found it suffocating. It was his foreman, Walt Grady, who finally said what needed saying. Walt was a man of 60, with a gray mustache, and the patience of a man who had spent 30 years working around difficult animals, both four-legged and otherwise. He showed up at the door of Gideon's study one evening in mid-October and stood there until Gideon looked up from his account books. 12 days, Walt said. Gideon set down his pen. 12 days until what? Until Miss Harcourt arrives from St. Louis. Walt didn't move from the doorway, didn't fidget, just said the words like he was reporting on weather. You told me to remind you when it got close. Gideon stared at him, then looked around his study as if seeing it with someone else's eyes for the first time. The dust on the bookshelves, the stack of untouched newspapers going back to August. Coffee ring on the side table that had been there so long it had become part of the furniture. Right, Gideon said. The east bedrooms haven't been opened since spring. Walt paused. Parlor smells like a storage shed, and I'm pretty sure something died in the south pantry, though I'd rather not know what. I'll hire someone. You've said that before, Walt. I'm just saying. The old foreman finally moved, stepping back from the doorway. The woman coming to marry you is from St. Louis. She's used to things being a certain way. You want her walking into this house and thinking she's made a terrible mistake before she's even had a chance to unpack? Gideon didn't answer, which was answer enough. The next morning, he rode into Broken Spur and looked at every notice on the general store board, the post office wall, and the door of the feed store. There were 3 possibilities. 2 were from women he already knew and had already dismissed for reasons he didn't bother examining too closely. The 3rd was written in a plain, even hand with no flourishes and no flattery. Experienced cook and housekeeper. 12 years service across Nebraska, Wyoming, and Montana territory. Capable of managing a full household on short notice. 1 condition, honest work only. Ask for Mara Ellison at the Broken Spur rooming house. He read it twice, then a 3rd time. The condition struck him as strange. Every notice promised honest work, but nobody stated it like a requirement rather than an assumption. Like a warning more than an advertisement. He asked for Mara Ellison at the rooming house. She came downstairs 10 minutes later, and the first thing he noticed was that she didn't look pleased to be summoned, even by a man of his standing. The second thing he noticed was that she didn't try to hide that fact. Mara Ellison was 29 years old, though she could have passed for older or younger, and her mood, which was apparently not a gentle one at that particular moment. She was medium height, lean from work rather than lack of food, with dark hair pinned back without ceremony and brown eyes that assessed him the way a cattleman assessed stock quickly, thoroughly, and without particular deference. She was wearing a dress that had been mended at the hem and the left cuff. 1 bag sat at the foot of the stairs, already packed. Gideon noted all of this in about 4 seconds. "Mr. Mercer," she said, not a greeting, an acknowledgement. "Miss Ellison," he held up the notice, the condition. "Which part's confusing you?" He blinked. "None of it." "I wanted to ask what you meant by it." She looked at him steadily. "I meant if you ask me to do something I know is wrong, cover up a problem on the ranch, lie to a visitor, prepare a meal I know will make someone sick, I won't do it. I'll tell you why, and if you still want it done, you can find somebody else." She paused. "That's happened twice. Both times I was right. Neither employer thanked me for it." He was quiet for a moment. "And you're still putting it on notices?" "Correct." He folded the notice and put it in his coat pocket. 12 days. I need the house ready before then. Full kitchen, main rooms, at least 3 guest bedrooms. What's the condition of the kitchen now? Cold, empty. Functional, garden, dormant, possibly dead. Pantry? He thought about what Walt had said. I'd approach it carefully. Something moved across her face that wasn't quite a smile. Wages? He named a figure that was fair by any standard. She picked up her bag. "I'll want a full inventory of what's available before I give you a list of what's needed. And I'll need access to every room, not just the ones you're comfortable with someone seeing." He held her gaze for just a moment. "Fine," he said again. She walked past him toward the door. That was how it started. She arrived at Black Ridge that same afternoon, and what she did first was not what Gideon expected. He assumed she would go to the kitchen. Instead, she walked through every room of the house slowly, without speaking, with the particular attention of someone who is not looking at what's there, but calculating what's missing. She opened curtains. She ran her fingers along window sills and checked them for warping. She pressed her palm to the fireplaces to gauge their draw. She pulled open the pantry door, and whatever was in there made her step back once before she went in anyway. Gideon followed her at a distance, unsure why. When she had finished, she stood in the main hallway and looked at him with an expression he couldn't immediately read. "You don't need somebody to clean this house," she said. "You need somebody to remind you what living in it looks like." He should have bristled at that. He was the employer. This was the first hour of the first day. She had no standing to say something like that to him. But the thing was, she wasn't being unkind. She wasn't making a point about his failings, or his grief, or his years of neglect. She was simply telling him what she saw, the same way a good doctor names what's wrong without apologizing for naming it. He stepped aside and let her work. By the second evening, there was a fire in the main fireplace. Not a small tentative fire, a real one, with enough wood behind it to actually warm the room. Gideon walked in from the barn after checking on a lame horse and stopped in the doorway, because for a moment he genuinely didn't recognize the space. Curtains were open. The furniture had been shifted not dramatically, just enough to face the firelight rather than the walls. The side table had a cloth on it. There was a smell in the room that took him several seconds to identify. Food. Real food. He walked to the kitchen and found Mara at the stove with the focused quiet of someone who had made 10,000 meals and saw no particular glory in it. A pot of something with root vegetables and salt pork was giving off steam. There was actual bread on the counter. Cooling, she didn't look up. "Sit down if you're going to eat. I'm not serving in the dining room until I've had the table cleaned properly." He sat down at the kitchen table without thinking twice about it. She set a bowl in front of him and went back to the stove. He ate. It was the best meal he'd had in, he stopped trying to count, a long time. He almost said something grateful, then decided it would come out wrong, and said nothing. She didn't seem to need him to. Over the next 5 days, the house began to change in ways that were both practical and, in some way Gideon couldn't have articulated, moral. The kitchen was stocked from a supply run. She organized and priced within a budget she hadn't asked him to approve, but which came in below what he would have authorized anyway. The garden, which she had declared dormant but not dead, was replanted in the sections that could still receive roots before the hard freeze. She organized the ranch hands into a brief rotation for pacing household maintenance, replacing a cracked window pane, fixing the latch on the cellar door, patching a section of the stable wall that had been letting cold air into the horse stalls. These were things that had been on Gideon's list for months. None of it had been on Mara's list at all. She had simply noticed them and handled them the way she handled everything, without announcement, without waiting for permission, without needing credit. On the 6th day, one of the younger ranch hands, a boy of about 19 named Arlo, came in from the northern range with his hand wrapped in a dirty cloth and the particular gray color around his mouth that Gideon recognized as a man trying very hard not to show pain. Mara had him seated at the kitchen table before anyone else had registered the problem. She unwrapped the cloth. The boy had caught his palm on rusted wire, deep enough to require attention, and cleaned the wound with a steady hand and a complete absence of ceremony that somehow made it less frightening. "When did this happen?" she asked. "This morning," Slow said, teeth clenched. "Why'd you wait until now to come in?" "Didn't want to be trouble." She looked up from his hand, just briefly. "You would have been a lot more trouble if this had gone bad overnight. Use your head next time." The boy nodded, staring at the floor. "At me," she said. He looked. "It's a bad cut, not a disaster. You'll keep the hand." She wrapped it with clean cloth from her supply kit. "But if it starts going hot tomorrow, you come straight in. Don't let it go a second day. Do you understand me?" "Yes, ma'am." "Good." She tied off the bandage. "Now go sit by the fire for 10 minutes before you get back on a horse. You've lost blood, and you're cold, and you're going to fall off that saddle if you leave now." She said all of this without looking at Gideon. But Gideon was watching. He had a decent ranch crew. He had Walt Grady, who was as good a foreman as existed in that part of Montana. He paid fair wages and kept his men fed and housed better than most operations their size. But nobody on his crew had ever told Arlo Sims that it was all right to need help without it costing him something. Nobody had said, "You'll keep the hand," in that matter of fact. There's no other option tone that made it true simply by being said. He thought about that long after dinner. On the 9th day, things got more complicated. Walt brought Gideon a finding from the north pasture fence line. A section that had been patched the previous spring had shifted, and not in the usual way. Posts weren't rotting. They were loose in a specific pattern, consistent with having been deliberately pulled and reset, sloppily, sometime in the past few months. Gideon walked the line himself. Walt was right. 300 yards of fence, and whoever had tampered with it wasn't a rustler. A rustler would have taken cattle. This was about the fence line itself, about the survey markers it followed. "Could be someone testing where your eastern boundary sits," Walt said. Gideon stared at the ground. "Who's been interested in that boundary?" Walt didn't answer immediately, which meant he had a name he wasn't sure he should say. "Walt, Langford's men have been riding that road more than usual," the foreman said carefully. "That's all I know for certain." The name Victor Langford settled over Gideon like a cold wind. He'd met the man once at a territorial cattlemen's meeting in Helena, and once at a dinner hosted by the county land commissioner. Langford was from the East, well-dressed, educated, with the specific kind of easy confidence that came from never having had to prove himself the hard way. He represented an investment company with a long name that nobody in the county could quite remember in full. He had also, in the past 18 months, acquired controlling interests in water rights, connected to at least 3 smaller operations range near the southern edge of Black Ridge's range. Gideon had noted it. had not yet determined what it meant. He was beginning to think he'd waited too long to find out. Came back from the fence line that evening to find Mara in the study. Not cleaning, she had been in the study before and had cleaned it already, but standing at the desk looking at something. When she heard him, she looked up immediately and took a step back. "I wasn't reading your papers," she said. "I was returning this." She held up an envelope. It had fallen behind the desk. "I found it when I moved the chair to sweep." He took it. It was an old letter from his father's attorney, dated 4 years back, regarding the original Eastern Boundary Survey of Black Ridge. He hadn't thought about it in years. He looked at her. She looked back. "The eastern fence line," she said. "The original survey, or has it moved?" He was quiet for a moment. "Why?" "Because I was pulling wire off the garden fence this morning to fix the gate, and the spool I found in the supply barn is a different gauge than what's on the north pasture line. Different gauge, different age. Someone replaced a section of that fence within the past year." She paused. "I wasn't looking for it, I just noticed." He stood there for a long moment. "What else have you noticed?" he said. She considered him. Seemed to be deciding something. "The water table on your south well is about 6 inches lower than it was when I first drew from it 3 weeks ago. Could be seasonal. Could be something pulling from upstream." Another pause. "And there's a man who's ridden past the main gate 4 times in the past week. Same horse, different hats. He doesn't stop, doesn't wave, doesn't look directly at the property. Just rides past." Gideon was very still. "You're counting." "I notice things," she said, simply, without apology. The same way she'd stated her condition on the notice. He thought about the fence line, and the letter in his hand, and the water, and Victor Langford's men on the eastern road, and he felt, for the first time in years, a sensation he hadn't anticipated. He was not, at that moment, alone in whatever was coming. He wasn't sure what to do with that. He was still thinking about it when Walt knocked on the study door the following morning with news that Victor Langford had requested a meeting at the ranch to discuss what he called, in his letter, a mutually beneficial arrangement regarding Blackridge's water assets. Gideon read the letter twice. Then he set it on the desk and looked at the Eastern Boundary Survey his father's attorney had written about 4 years ago. Outside, across the yard, through the study window, he could see the kitchen fire lit, the smoke rising from the chimney in a straight line against the cold morning sky. Somewhere inside that house, Mara Ellison was already 3 steps ahead of a problem she hadn't been hired to solve. And the man in the expensive coat was coming. Victor Langford arrived at Blackridge Ranch on a Tuesday morning, and he arrived the way men like him always did, with too much confidence and not enough reason for it. His carriage was expensive without being flashy, which Gideon recognized as a calculated choice. Men who showed up in flashy carriages were trying to impress you. Men who showed up in quietly expensive ones were trying to make you feel like you were both the same kind of person. Like whatever he was proposing was simply 2 equals having a reasonable conversation. Gideon met him in the yard. Langford stepped down with the easy movement of a man who had done this particular performance many times and had stopped thinking about it. He was somewhere in his mid-50s, clean-shaved, with gray at his temples and the kind of steady eye contact that worked very well on people who hadn't been warned about it. "Mr. Mercer," he extended his hand. "I appreciate you making the time." Gideon shook it. "You said it was important." I said mutually beneficial. Langford smiled. "Which in my experience tends to be the same thing." They went inside to the study. Gideon had told Walt to stay near the house, which Walt had done without asking why, which was one of the many reasons Walt Grady had kept his job for 22 years. Mara was in the kitchen. She had been in the kitchen when Langford's carriage came up the drive, and she had stayed there, which was appropriate. She had no reason to be in the study, no reason at all. Langford set his leather case on the desk and removed a document that was, on its surface, exactly what he described it to be. Clean pages, precise language, a straightforward arrangement. Blackridge Ranch would enter into a water-sharing agreement with Langford's investment company, the Territorial Land and Resource Development Corporation, which was the kind of name specifically designed to be too long, to remember allowing a secondary draw from Blackridge's senior water filing on the north branch of the creek during periods of adequate flow. In exchange, Langford's company would provide Gideon with a cash payment up front and a percentage of any downstream agricultural development the company facilitated using that water access. "It's a good arrangement," Langford said, leaning back slightly in his chair. He had the posture of a man who had learned that taking up space made other people smaller. The water sits there regardless. You're not losing anything you're currently using. You're simply monetizing an asset that's costing you nothing. Gideon looked at the document without picking it up. Who else has signed something like this? I'm not at liberty to discuss other parties. In this county. Mr. Langford's smile stayed exactly where it was. I understand caution. It's a quality I respect in a businessman. But I've worked across 6 territories, and I can tell you with confidence that arrangements like this one are standard practice in developed land markets. Montana is catching up. Catching up, Gideon repeated, to where the rest of the country already is. Gideon finally picked up the document. He was not a lawyer, but he was not an uneducated man. He read contracts. He had read dozens of them, over the years, grazing agreements, sale documents, banknotes, supply arrangements. Most of its windows were dark. He knew what clean language looked like, and he knew what language that was trying to look clean looked like. This looked clean. That bothered him more than anything else. He read it twice, found nothing that alarmed him. The draw percentage was small. Payment was fair. The terms were clear, and yet, give me until this afternoon, Gideon said. Langford nodded without hesitation, which was its own kind of tell. A man who needed the answer urgently would have pushed. A man who already knew the answer was coming didn't need to. Of course, he closed his leather case. I'll ride into town and come back at 3. He left. Gideon sat at the desk for a moment after the carriage pulled away, looking at the document in his hands. Then he walked to the kitchen. Mara was at the counter rolling out pastry dough for a dinner pie, and she didn't stop when he came in, which was normal. She didn't stop for much. I need you to look at something, he said. She did stop then. She looked at him first, not at the document in his hand. Like she was checking his face before she decided how to respond. She said, she washed the flour off her hands with the particular thoroughness of someone who understood that the hands you use for one thing need to be fully present for the next thing. She dried them. She took the document. She read it the way she had walked through his house. On the first day slowly, without expression, from beginning to end, and then back again to specific sections. She was silent for 4 minutes. He counted without meaning to. Then she set the document on the kitchen table and pressed her palm flat on top of it. Page 3, she said. 3rd paragraph from the bottom. Read me the 2nd sentence. He leaned over and found it. In the event of declared drought conditions, as defined by Territorial Commission, Standard RC 7, the secondary draw allocation shall be renegotiated to reflect adjusted senior priority determinations. He read it once. Read it again. Looked at her. What does that mean? He said. It means, Mara said quietly, that during a drought, which is exactly when your water matters. Most this clause allows them to challenge your senior water filing and claim priority rights over your draw. She pulled her hand off the document like it had gotten warm. If they succeed in that renegotiation, they don't need to steal a single acre from you. They just turn off your water during the only time of year when losing it would actually kill the ranch. The kitchen was very quiet. Gideon looked at the document again. The sentence hadn't changed. It was right there, sitting between 2 other perfectly reasonable sentences, dressed up in the kind of careful legal language that made it sound like standard administrative procedure. How do you know what RC7 is? He said. Mara didn't answer immediately. How do you know what that means? He said again. And this time his voice was different, not suspicious, exactly, but focused. The way he sounded when he was following a track and wanted to know where it led. She was quiet for another moment. Then she pulled out a chair and sat down at the kitchen table, which was not something she typically did during working hours. And that alone told him something had shifted. My father owned land, she said, a homestead in Nebraska. 40 acres, which isn't much, but it was his. He'd worked it for 11 years. Gideon sat down across from her. He couldn't read, Mara said. Not really. He could write his name. He could recognize numbers well enough to count a calf head, but legal documents that was a different world. She wasn't looking at Gideon. She was looking at the table, which meant she was somewhere else entirely. A man came to him when I was 17. Businessman. Very polished. He had an arrangement that sounded like what Mr. Langford described to you, sharing access, monetizing an asset, all of it. My father signed. What happened? What happened is that 2 years later, when Nebraska had 2 dry summers back to back, that man used a clause almost identical to the one on page 3 to renegotiate my father's water rights. The renegotiation took 9 months. During those 9 months, my father couldn't run water to half his acreage. He borrowed against the land to survive that first season. When the renegotiation concluded, his senior rights had been officially reduced. She paused. The land was worth a third of what it had been. He couldn't repay the loan. We lost it. Gideon said nothing. My father died 4 years later, Mara said. He wasn't sick. He just stopped. Some men do that when the thing they built is gone. They go through the motions for a while, and then they stop. She said it the way she said most things plainly, without decoration. But her hands, which were flat on the table, had gone still in a way they usually weren't. I blamed myself, she said, for years, because I was 17 and I could read and I was right there and I didn't understand what I was looking at in time. She looked up. After we lost the farm, I made sure I would never not understand it again. You taught yourself, Gideon said. I had 12 years and I had access to enough household libraries that the employers mostly didn't notice what I was reading. Land filings, property law, contract structures, methods. She met his eyes steadily. I'm not a lawyer, I want to be clear about that. But I know what that sentence on page 3 means because I have seen its first cousin before, and I know what it cost. The fire in the kitchen stove popped once and settled. Gideon looked at the document on the table between them. He had been 30 seconds for him reading it a third time and finding nothing wrong with it. The man who came to your father, he said. Mara nodded slowly. His name was Calvin Rusk. He didn't recognize the name. He filed it away anyway. I'm going to send for Edmund Pike, Gideon said. Pike was the best territorial attorney in the county, careful, meticulous, a man who had an almost personal offense to dishonest paperwork. That would be wise, Marissa said. She stood up, pulled the document off the table and handed it back to him. Then she went back to the counter and picked up the rolling pin. He stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment. Mara. She looked back. Thank you, he said. She gave a small single nod and went back to the pastry. He sent a rider for Pike before noon. Edmund Pike arrived at Blackridge the following morning, earlier than expected, which meant he'd ridden fast, which meant whoever had sent word ahead of Gideon's messenger had given him a reason to. He came in with mud on his boots and his coat unbuttoned, and the expression of a man who had already begun thinking about something on the road and hadn't finished yet. He was 63, bald across the top with a ring of white hair around the sides, and he had the specific physical quality of a man who had spent 4 decades in a chair, reading small print, a slight forward lean, eyes that focused faster than the rest of his face. He had represented Blackridge Ranch on 3 previous matters, and Gideon trusted him without reservation, which was not something Gideon said easily about anyone. Pike read the document at the study desk with a lamp pulled close, even though it was full morning, because that was how he read important things. He used a pen to mark specific passages, not to write on the document itself, but to point, the pen moving in small circles the way a doctor used a finger on an X-ray. When he finished, he set the pen down and was quiet for a long moment. Where did you get the initial warning on page 3? He said. Gideon hesitated for only a second. My housekeeper. Looked up. Your housekeeper, yes. The attorney studied him. How does your housekeeper know about RC7 protocol? She has her reasons. They're hers to tell, not mine. Gideon met his gaze. She right. Pike looked back at the document. She's right, he said. She's more than right, actually. Because the page 3 clause is designed to look like administrative language. But it works in conjunction with a clause on page 6, look here, which defines what constitutes an authorized senior rights challenge. These 2 sections together create a mechanism where Langford's company can force a renegotiation, then stall the renegotiation process long enough to damage your operational capacity during the drought period before any ruling is even issued. He set both hands flat on the desk. You would not necessarily lose the ranch in court, but you could lose 2 or 3 seasons' worth of operations. While the case proceeded, which for a ranch your size running cattle numbers you run could be catastrophic. Gideon was very still. What I want to know, Pike said, is whether he's done this before. I think he has, Gideon said. Do you have names? He mentioned other arrangements in the county. Wouldn't say who. Pike leaned back. I'll find out who. He said it with the quiet certainty of a man who had spent 4 decades knowing the right people to call. This kind of structure doesn't get built in a single county. It requires practice. It requires refinement. He tapped page 3 with one finger. This clause is too clean. Someone spent time on it. That was Wednesday. By Thursday afternoon, Pike had ridden to 2 neighboring properties and come back with news that landed in Gideon's chest like a stone dropped in cold water. 2 ranchers Hector Baines on the South Range and the Aldrich family 2 valleys east had already signed. Their documents were slightly different in surface language, but the core mechanism was the same. Senior water rights, drought clause, renegotiation trigger. They had signed because nobody had told them not to. They trusted him, Pike said. He wasn't angry exactly. Most of its windows were dark. He was something beyond anger, the particular grimness of a man who had seen this before and thought the lessons had already been learned. Baines is 67 years old. He's been ranching that land for 30 years. The Aldriches have 3 children. They thought they were making a smart arrangement. Gideon sat with that for a moment. Can they get out of it? I'm looking into that. The contracts may have been signed under misrepresentation, which could give us grounds. But I need time. Pike looked at him. And I need whoever gave you the initial read on page 3 to tell me everything she knows. Because what I'm starting to see here is not a single transaction. It's a pattern. That was the word that changed things. Gideon went to the kitchen that evening and told Mara everything Pike had said. He didn't soften it, and he didn't summarize it. He told it the way it was, including Baines and the Aldriches, including the word pattern, including the fact that Pike wanted to speak with her. Mara listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, with her back to the stove, arms crossed, looking at the floor. "The man who destroyed my father's farm," she said. "Calvin Rusk. I told you his name yesterday." "Yes." "After we lost the land, I spent some time trying to understand what had happened. Not right away, I was too angry right away. But later, she looked up. Rusk didn't operate alone. He had a partner in his investment company. Partner handled the legal documents. I could never find out who it was because I didn't have any money or any standing, and people don't tell you things when you're a 19-year-old girl with nowhere to live." She stopped. Gideon waited. "I want to see Langford's full company filing," Mara said. "His incorporation documents. Whatever Pike can get from the territorial registry." She was quiet for another moment. The kind of quiet that meant she was deciding how much to say. "Because the clause on page 3 isn't something a land investor invents on his own," she said. "He needs a specific kind of legal mind, the same kind that built what Rusk used on my father's contract." She paused. "I want to know if it's the same hand." Gideon looked at her for a long moment. "I'll tell Pike," he said. He almost left it at that. He was at the kitchen doorway. And he almost walked out without saying anything more, and later he would think about that moment and what would have been different if he had. But he didn't. "Mara," he said. She looked at him. "This is going to get complicated," he said. Not as a warning, exactly. As a statement of fact. "If Pike pursues the pattern, the neighboring ranches, all of it won't stay quiet. Langford is going to know someone identified the clause. He'll know it wasn't me." She held his gaze. "I know that. I'm not asking you to stay out of it," he said carefully. "I'm telling you what it might cost." "I know what it might cost," she said. Most of its windows were dark, and there was something in her voice when she said it that was different from how she usually spoke. Not harder, she was always direct, but older somehow. Like she was speaking from a place that had already survived the worst version of this and was still standing. He nodded and left. The next morning, Evelyn Harcourt arrived from St. Louis. Gideon had not forgotten she was coming. He had simply, in the compressed intensity of the past 4 days, run out of mental space to think about it in the way he probably should have. She arrived in a hired carriage from the Broken Spur station, exactly on time, because Evelyn Harcourt was precisely that kind of woman. She was 40 years old, composed in the way that came not from coldness, but from having managed her own life independently for a long time. She had fine-boned features and gray eyes that missed very little, and she stepped down from the carriage in traveling clothes that were practical without being dowdy, because she understood that coming to a working ranch in St. Louis finery would have said the wrong thing. Gideon met her in the yard. They shook hands they had met twice before, during the discussions between their respective connections that had led to this arrangement, and both times it had been perfectly cordial and perfectly clear that what they were constructing was practical rather than passionate, which had been, until approximately 10 days ago, something Gideon had considered entirely sufficient. "The house looks better than I expected," Evelyn said, looking up at the main building. She said it without any particular warmth and without any particular criticism, simply as an observation. "Someone's been working on it," Gideon said. "Your housekeeper?" "Yes." Evelyn looked at him briefly, then back at the house. "Well, that was overdue, I imagine." She was given the east guest room, which smelled of fresh linen and had a small fire already burning, courtesy of Mara's routine, which had by now become as automatic as the house's breathing. Evelyn met Mara that afternoon in the kitchen when she came down looking for tea. It was a short interaction. Mara made the tea, answered 2 practical questions about meal times and water for the basin, and went back to whatever she had been doing. Evelyn stood in the kitchen afterward for a moment before returning to her room. She had watched Mara move through the kitchen efficiently, without waste, with the particular confidence of someone who completely owned the space they were in. She had watched Gideon's house operate with a competence and warmth that she was intelligent enough to recognize had not come from Gideon himself. She filed this away without drawing a conclusion from it. That was Evelyn's way. She gathered information before she decided what it meant. It was 3 days after Evelyn's arrival that Pike came back with something that stopped the room. He came in the late afternoon, when the light was going orange and long through the study windows, and he sat down across from Gideon with a look on his face that Gideon had never seen on him, before. Not alarmed, exactly, but the expression of a man who had found something significantly larger than he'd been looking for. "Langford's company," Pike said. "The Territorial Land and Resource Development Corporation, incorporated in Montana Territory 14 months ago." He opened his case. Before that, he operated under a company called Western Range Investment Partners out of Wyoming. Before that, High Plains Agricultural Trust out of Kansas. He set 3 documents on the desk. Different names, same legal architecture, same drought clause, same renegotiation trigger, same senior rights mechanism. Territories over 14 years. Gideon looked at the documents. "And the legal author," Pike said. "The man who drafted these contracts, it took me 2 days to trace it through the incorporation filings, because he's changed his listed role each time. But the language is identical. Identical, Gideon, down to the specific phrasing of the RC7 reference, which is not standard language. Someone wrote that phrase once and has been using it ever since." He paused. "His name is on the original Kansas, filing as founding legal counsel." Gideon looked up. "Calvin Rusk," Pike said. The study was completely quiet. Gideon set down the papers, stood up from the desk. Walked if its windows were dark, walked to the window and stood there for a moment looking out at the yard where the last of the afternoon light was across the fence line. "Calvin Rusk. Mara's father's land, Nebraska 12 years ago. The same hand." He turned around. "She needs to know." "Yes," Pike said, "she does, and I need to speak with her. Because if Rusk is Langford's legal architect, then Mara Ellison is not simply a woman who caught a suspicious clause. She's a witness to the origins of this operation." He looked at Gideon carefully, "which means Langford's people are eventually going to figure out who flagged the contract. And when they do, they're going to look at who you hired 10 days ago, and they are going to recognize her name." Gideon felt the floor of the situation shift under him. "How long do we have," he said, "before they figure it out?" "I don't know. Not long if Langford is as careful as his paperwork suggests." Pike began gathering his documents. "I want to file an emergency petition to freeze the Baines and Aldrich agreements pending a fraud investigation. To do that, I need to move fast, and I need Mara's account of what happened to her father's property as corroborating evidence of a pattern. She'll give it." "I don't doubt that," Pike said. "What I doubt is that Langford will let her give it without attempting to interfere." Gideon told Mara that evening. He did it in the kitchen, which was where they had most of their real conversations, because that was the room where she was most herself, not performing competence for an employer, not being careful, just present. He waited until after the dinner dishes were done and the kitchen had gone quiet. And then he sat down at the table and told her all of it. Company names, the 6 territories, the identical clause, the name on the Kansas filing. Mara stood at the far end of the kitchen with her back against the counter and didn't say anything for what felt like a full minute. "Calvin Rusk," she said finally. "Yes." Another silence. "They've been doing this for 14 years, she said. She looked at the ceiling briefly. Not the gesture of someone searching for something, the gesture of someone absorbing an impact and deciding how they were going to stand after it. "How many families?" she said. "Pike doesn't know yet. He's still tracing the earlier companies." She lowered her chin and looked at him. Her eyes were dry, but there was something behind them, not grief, not anger, something harder and older than either. "My father wasn't the first," she said. "No, he was just the one I was there for." Gideon said nothing, because there was nothing to say to that. Mara was quiet for a long moment. Then she straightened up from the counter and folded the dishcloth she'd been holding, precisely the way she did everything. "Tell Pike I'll speak with him." she said. Whenever he's ready. She didn't ask about the risk. She didn't ask about what Langford might do when he found out. She didn't ask for reassurance, which was fortunate, because Gideon wasn't certain he could give it in any form that would be worth having. What she asked, after a moment, was something he didn't expect. The Aldriches, she said. The family with the 3 children. How old are the children? He thought about it. Pike mentioned the youngest is about 4. She nodded, looked at the folded dishcloth in her hands. Looked up. Then we need to move fast, she said. Pike filed the emergency petition the following morning. By afternoon, word had moved through Broken Spur the way all significant words moved through small towns faster than fire, and with less accuracy. By evening, a rider Gideon didn't recognize had come to the gate, claimed to have a message for the ranch, and when Walt went to take it, had turned around and left without leaving anything. Walt came back and told Gideon. Gideon told Walt to keep 2 men near the house overnight. He didn't tell Mara about the rider. He told himself it was because there was no confirmed threat, nothing concrete to report. That was partly true. The other part was that he wasn't ready to look at her and tell her that Langford's people had already found out. Because then, the cost he'd warned her about would become real, and for reasons he didn't examine carefully enough that evening, the idea of that cost landing on Mara Ellison was something he felt in his chest in a way that went significantly past employer concern. He sat in the kitchens alone after midnight, when the fire had burned down to coals, and he thought about that for a long time. In the east guest room, Evelyn Harcourt was awake too. She had heard Walt's voice in the yard. She had heard the particular silence that followed it, the silence of men who were being careful about what they said in front of a house with open windows. She was an intelligent woman. She understood the outline of what was happening because she had asked the right careful questions over the past 3 days and had gotten enough answers between what was said and what wasn't said build a reasonable picture. She also understood something that neither Gideon nor Mara had said aloud to anyone, possibly including themselves. She lay in the dark room with the low fire for company and considered her situation with the same unsentimental clarity she applied to most things. She had come to Montana for a practical arrangement with a decent man, which was a reasonable thing to want at 40 years old, when practical arrangements were what life had made available. She had expected a certain kind of house and a certain kind of life. What she had found instead was a house that had been brought back to life by someone else, and a man who, in 10 days, had become more animated, more present, and more fully himself than she suspected he had been in years. She didn't resent it. She was too honest for resentment and too sensible for self-pity. But she lay in the dark, and she understood something that was going to require a decision from her sooner or later. Outside, the Montana night was cold and very quiet. Inside Blackridge, 3 people in 3 separate rooms were lying awake, each of them carrying something the other 2 didn't know about yet. And in the morning, the man in the expensive coat was going to find out that his trap had been identified. What happened after that, none of them were fully prepared for. Threatening letter arrived on a Friday. It came tucked inside what appeared to be a routine mail delivery, a supply invoice, a copy of the Helena newspaper. Most of its windows were dark, and an envelope with no return address that Walt had set on the kitchen table without thinking much about it, because it looked like correspondence, and correspondence arrived at Blackridge like everything else, without announcement. Mara found it when she came in from the garden. She almost set it aside. There was bread rising, and the morning had already been full, and her hands were cold, and she was thinking about the water situation on the south well, which Pike's investigation had flagged as a secondary concern worth documenting. She almost set it aside and came back to it later. She didn't. She opened it. The letter was short, 6 sentences, written in a clean, educated hand that was worse somehow than if it had been scrawled in anger, because the cleanness of it meant the person writing it had not been agitated, had not been emotional at all, had written it the way you write a business communication, with the same calm you'd use for a supply order or a meeting request. It said, Miss Ellison, you have placed yourself in a situation that does not concern you. Your involvement in Mr. Mercer's contractual affairs has been noted. If you proceed with any sworn statement to Attorney Pike or any territorial authority, documentation will be provided to every household and business in the Montana Territory confirming that you stole $40 from your last employer in Cheyenne. This is not a negotiation. Consider what a ruined reputation means for a woman in your position. You have until Wednesday. There was no signature. Mara stood in the kitchen and read it twice. Then she set it on the table, smoothed it flat with one hand, and stood there for a moment with her palm pressed against the paper and her eyes fixed on the middle distance. Bread was rising. The kitchen fire was doing what it always did. Outside the window, she could hear one of the ranch hands moving equipment in the yard, the particular scrape of iron on frozen ground, the kind of sound that meant ordinary life going on at its ordinary pace. The letter up, folded it carefully, and put it in her apron pocket. Then she went back to the bread. She didn't tell Gideon that morning. She told herself it was because she needed to think, which was true. She also told herself it was because she needed to verify something first, which was also true. But there was a third reason she didn't examine closely, which was that telling Gideon meant watching his face change, watching him feel responsible, protective, and conflicted in whatever proportion those three things would arrange themselves in his expression, and she wasn't ready to be the cause of that yet. She was still thinking it through when Pike arrived, mid-morning, unscheduled, with the look on his face that she had learned meant he had found something he hadn't been looking for. He went to the study with Gideon, and she heard the door close. She told herself that was fine, that it was none of her business until it was her business, and she spent 20 minutes checking the latch on the cellar door that had been sticking again before Gideon appeared in the kitchen doorway. "Pike wants you in the study," he said. She dried her hands and went. Pike was standing at the desk, which he only did when he was too worked up to sit. His coat was still on, which meant he hadn't planned to stay long, though she had come to understand that Pike's plans rarely survived contact with what he actually found. "I got the full territorial registry for Langford's company this morning," Pike said, looking at her directly in the way of a man who had decided to stop being careful. "And I cross-referenced it with the Wyoming and Kansas filings." He set a document on the desk. "Calvin Rusk isn't just the legal architect. He's a named partner in Langford's current Montana operation. Most of its windows, they've been working together for at least a decade under different company names, but they've always been working together." Mara looked at the document. Rusk's name was there in the partnership filing, third from the top. "Does Rusk know I'm here?" she said. "That's what I came to tell you," Pike said. "I believe he does now. Someone pulled your name from Langford's records of the Blackridge meeting, and someone made an inquiry to the Broken Spur County clerk about your employment history 2 days ago." He paused. "The clerk told me this morning because he thought it was peculiar." Mara reached into her apron pocket and put the letter on the desk. Both men looked at it. Gideon picked it up. She watched his face as he read it, and she watched the exact progression she had predicted, the tightening around the eyes. The particular stillness that on some men meant anger, and on Gideon meant something more controlled and more dangerous. He read it to the end. "Wednesday," he said. "Yes, today is Friday. I'm aware." He looked at her. "You found this morning?" "Yes. And you were going to tell me." "When I was ready," she said. She said it calmly, without apology, because she wasn't sorry, and pretending to be sorry would have been a waste of both their time. Gideon looked like he had several things to say and was choosing between them. Pike picked up the letter, read it himself, set it back down with the particular expression of a man whose opinion of the situation had just gotten significantly worse. "Theft accusation, $40 in Cheyenne. Do you know where that comes from?" "No," Mara said. "I worked in Cheyenne for 8 months. The Hartley household. I left on good terms. I have a letter of reference from Mrs. Hartley that I keep in my bag." She paused. "Whatever documentation they're referring to doesn't exist yet. They'll manufacture it. Can you prove where you were and what you earned during your time there?" "I can prove most of it. Most. There were 2 months where I was between households. I stayed at a boarding house. The woman who ran it died 2 years ago." She said it without flinching. "So that portion of my timeline has gaps I can't fill with witnesses." Pike sat down heavily. They chose the claim carefully. "Yes," Mara said they did. The study was quiet for a moment. Outside, wind moved against the window. Gideon was still looking at the letter on the desk. He hadn't looked at Mara again, since she'd told him she was waiting until she was ready. And she couldn't tell from his profile what he was thinking. "I'm going to testify," Mara said. Both men looked at her. "I want to be clear about that," she said. "The letter doesn't change it. I've thought about it since I read it this morning, and I've thought about it longer than this morning in a general way, and my answer is the same." She looked at Pike. "What do you need from me, and when do you need it?" Pike opened his case. I've requested an emergency hearing in Helena. The territorial judge assigned to land disputes is a man named Calvert Haynes. He's not easy, and he's not fast, but he is fair, which is all I need him to be. He set several papers on the desk. I need your sworn account of what happened to your father's property in Nebraska. Timeline, the specific contract terms as best as you remember them, and your identification of the similarities between that contract and Langford's current documents. He paused. I also need you to be prepared to be questioned on your qualifications. Langford's attorney will argue that you have no standing to interpret legal documents. I know, Mara said. He'll be aggressive about it. I know that too. It will be uncomfortable. She looked at him. Mr. Pike, I've been uncomfortable before. It hasn't killed me yet. Something moved across his face that might have been the beginning of a smile. No, he said. I don't suppose it has. She spent that afternoon in the study with Pike going through the Nebraska timeline in detailed dates, names, contract terms she had reconstructed from memory and from the letters she had kept, the progression of events from signing to drought season to renegotiation to loss. She was meticulous about what she knew directly and what she was inferring, because she had been around Pike long enough to understand that a witness who oversold their certainty was more dangerous than a witness who admitted their limits. Pike wrote everything down, asked clarifying questions without interrupting her rhythm. When she was done, he sat back and then looked at his notes. You have a remarkable memory, he said. I worked at it, she said, deliberately. I was afraid of forgetting the details and then not being able to explain what had happened to anyone who would listen. Did anyone listen? She thought about that. Not before now. The attacks started the following Tuesday. It began as rumor, the particular kind of rumor that moves through a small town not as gossip, but as concern. As people sharing something worrying with each other out of care, which made it worse than outright because it came wrapped in the language of looking out for someone. A man Mara had never seen before had been asking questions at the general store, the feed merchant, and the dry goods shop, about a housekeeper at Black Ridge Ranch, whether anyone knew her, whether she'd had trouble at previous positions, whether they'd heard anything about Cheyenne. By Tuesday evening, the question had become a statement. By Wednesday morning, the statement had become a fact. A theft accusation, people said, $40. The employer apparently had documents. Walt heard it in town when he went for supplies. He came back and told Gideon without embellishment, the way Walt did everything. Gideon went to find Mara. She was in the kitchen, which was where she usually was in the mornings, but she was not cooking. She was sitting at the table with a cup of coffee, going cold, in front of her, and a look on her face that he had not seen before, not the neutral competence she wore for work, not the quiet certainty she wore when she was reading a document or making a decision. Something older, something that knew exactly what was happening and had been half waiting for it. It started, he said. I heard Walt come in. He sat down across from her. They filed the complaint this morning. Pike got word an hour ago. There's a formal accusation registered with the county, citing a former employer named Thomas Breckett of Cheyenne, Wyoming, claiming you took from household funds in March of last year. Mara looked at her coffee cup. Thomas Breckett. You know him? I've never heard of him in my life. She said it flatly, without heat. March of last year I was in Billings. I can prove that. But they know I can prove it, which means the accusation isn't meant to hold up in court. It's meant to hold up in conversation. She paused. In the time between now and when I can prove it, everyone in Broken Spur will have heard it, decided what they think, and moved on to other concerns. That's enough. That's all they need it to do. Gideon was quiet for a moment. He was looking at her across the kitchen table, and he was thinking about what Walt had said in town, and what it meant for a woman alone to have her name moved through a community like this, not through any failing of her own, not through any actual wrong she had committed, but simply because someone with money and motive had decided she was an obstacle. He made a decision. I'm riding into town, he said. For what purpose? To make clear what I think of the accusation. She looked up at him. Gideon. It was the first time she'd used his given name directly. He wasn't certain she'd noticed. This is your business, she said carefully. Your ranch, your reputation. Going into town and publicly standing behind a housekeeper who's been accused of theft. Mara, he said it the same way she'd said his name straightforward. No particular weight to it, just the name. Stop, she stopped. I'm not asking your permission, he said. I'm telling you what I'm going to do. He rode into town with Walt beside him, which was a choice rather than a necessity. Walt's presence said something. The two of them together, on a Tuesday morning when there was ranch work waiting, said something more. Gideon didn't make a speech. He didn't call a meeting. He simply went to the general store, bought what Walt had come for, and in the ordinary course of that transaction said clearly and without particular emotion to the three men present that the accusation against Mara Ellison was fabricated, that he had been her employer for 3 weeks and had found her to be absolutely honest in every regard, and that anyone who had questions about her character could bring them directly to him. He said it once, in a normal voice, and then he finished the transaction and left. That was all. But in Broken Spur, that was enough to split the conversation. On one side, the accusation that had arrived from nowhere, from a man nobody knew. On the other side, Gideon Mercer's word, which in that county carried a specific weight that had been built over decades and couldn't be manufactured by an investment company from the East. Didn't end the rumor, but it complicated it. Mara was in the garden when he got back. She had been pulling dead Grenta bed's work that didn't need doing urgently, which meant she had gone outside because she needed to be doing something with her hands while she waited. He came around the side of the house and she looked up. He didn't say anything about what had happened in town. She didn't ask. Thank you, she said. Don't, he said. Don't what? Don't thank me like it was a favor. It wasn't a favor. It was the truth. She looked at him for a moment. Then she went back to the garden. He stood there for another few seconds, watching her hands move through the dead stalks with the same efficient certainty she applied to everything. And then he went back inside because there was nothing else to say and because he was not sure what he would have said if he'd stayed. Evelyn found him in the study an hour later. She knocked, which she always did, and came in and sat down in the chair across from his desk with the particular composure that was her natural state. She was dressed for indoor work. She had been helping sort through some correspondence. An offer she'd made herself, and which he'd accepted because it was genuinely useful, and she looked at him with the gray eyes that missed nothing. I want to say something, she said, and I want you to listen without responding until I'm done. All right, what you did this morning was the right thing. It was also not a purely employer's action. She paused. I'm not saying this to cause trouble. I'm saying it because I think you know it, and I think you'll handle the next incident better if you've admitted it to yourself, rather than finding out in an inconvenient moment. Quiet. I came here with reasonable expectations, Evelyn said. I didn't come expecting to love you, because I'm a practical woman, and I know what an arrangement is. I came expecting mutual respect, shared purpose, and a partnership that would be good for both of us. She folded her hands in her lap. What I found instead is a man who has been sleeping in a house for 6 years and just started living in it again. She looked at him steadily. I'm intelligent enough to see what woke it up. Gideon said nothing. I'm not leaving in anger, she said. I want to be very clear about that. There is no anger in me toward you or toward her. I simply think, and I think you know this, that the arrangement as designed no longer fits the situation. He looked at his desk. Evelyn, I'm not finished. He waited. Before I leave, I'm going to stay through the hearing, she said. Because what is happening here is important, and I have certain connections in Helena through my cousin's legal work that may be useful to Mr. I would like to offer them. She paused. Not for you particularly, for the Aldrich family. I heard about the children. He looked up. Her expression hadn't changed. I have a capacity for outrage that tends to organize itself more productively when I have something concrete to do about it. He was quiet for a long moment, then Evelyn, I'm sorry. Don't be sorry about what was honest, she said simply. Save your apologies for things that were actually wrong. She stood up and went back to the correspondence. The hearing in Helena was scheduled for the following Thursday, which gave them 9 days, during which the gossip in Broken Spur continued at a slow burn, during which Pike filed 3 additional motions, during which Evelyn quietly sent a letter to her cousin's law office in Helena that came back with information about Judge Calvert Haynes that proved more useful than anything else they had going in, and during which Calvin Rusk arrived in Montana. Pike found out on Sunday. A writer from Helena brought word that a man matching Rusk's description, mid-50s, heavy set, with a lawyer's briefcase and a business manner, had checked into the Grand Pacific Hotel under his own name, which meant either he was confident or he was careless, and men like Rusk were rarely careless. Confident, then. Gideon told Mara that evening she was in the kitchen. She was always in the kitchen when things went wrong, which he had stopped finding peculiar and had started to understand was simply where she thought most clearly near the stove, near something that needed doing, near the smell of something real. "He's here," Gideon said. She didn't react physically. Nothing moved in her face. Then slowly, she set down the spoon she was holding and looked at the wall for a moment. "He'll be at the hearing," she said. "Pike thinks so. He'll be there to coach Langford's attorney and to see me." She paused. "He needs to know who he's dealing with. Men like Rusk need to look at the threat and measure it." Another pause. "I'm the threat." "Yes," Gideon said. "Does that bother you?" "Which part?" "That you've put yourself in the middle of this because of me. Your ranch, your name." She stopped briefly. "Your previous arrangement, which I know is no longer what it was, and I know that's partly my fault." "It's not your fault," he said. "I came here to cook and keep house. I know that. And instead, Mara," he said her name with a quiet firmness that stopped her. "Stop making yourself responsible for things that were already broken before you arrived." She looked at him. "Evelyn and I were an arrangement," he said. "It was a fair arrangement between two reasonable adults. But it wasn't," he paused, choosing the word carefully, "it wasn't what either of us needed. I think she knew that before I did." He was quiet for a moment. "What's happening between you and whatever this is, I'm not going to name it in a kitchen on a Sunday night with a court hearing in 9 days. But I want you to stop looking at me like you owe me something for every decision I make of my own free will." Mara was very still. "All right," she said finally, quietly. "All right," he said. They stood on opposite sides of the kitchen. For a moment, the stove between them, the fire making its ordinary sounds. Then Mara picked up the spoon again and he went to the study. The morning before the Helena hearing, a second letter arrived. This one wasn't tucked into mail. It was delivered by a boy Mara had never seen, who handed it to her at the kitchen door and left at a run before she could ask him who'd sent him. The envelope had her name on the front in the same clean hand as the first letter. Opened it. This one was shorter, 3 sentences. "Your father signed his name to a document he didn't understand, which is a shame but not a crime. If you proceed tomorrow, you will spend the rest of your working life explaining that your name is not the name of a thief. The choice is yours." She read it standing in the kitchen doorway with the cold air coming in behind her. Then she went inside, fed the letter to the stove, and watched it burn. She had made her choice the morning she found the first one. They just hadn't understood that yet. They rode to Helena the next morning before dawn. Gideon, Walt, Pike, Mara, and Evelyn, who had insisted on coming with a firmness that brooked no argument, and who had turned out to be, over the previous week, not what anyone had expected. She was organized, precise, and had provided Pike with 3 pieces of procedural information about hands and task rulings that had genuinely altered his approach to the petition. The ride took most of the morning. They didn't talk much. Walt dozed on his horse the way old men could without falling. Pike reviewed his papers. Evelyn watched the landscape with the attention of someone storing it up. Mara rode with her eyes forward and her hands steady on the reins. Gideon rode beside her and said nothing because there was nothing he needed to say that she didn't already know. The territorial courthouse in Helena was a stone building with a heaviness to it that was partly the architecture and partly what had been decided inside it over the years. They arrived late morning. The corridor outside the hearing room was already occupied when they arrived. Langford was there. He was wearing the same kind of quietly expensive coat he'd worn at Blackridge, and he looked at Gideon without expression, which was its own kind of statement. Beside Langford stood a tall, thin attorney named from his introduction to be Harmon Vale, sharp-faced, with the professional ease of a man who had spent his career dismantling other people's arguments. And beside Vale stood Calvin Rusk. Mara saw him the moment she came through the corridor door. He was heavier than she remembered, older. The hair at his temples had gone entirely white. But the face was the same, the particular broad steadiness of a man who had never in his adult life made to answer for what he'd done, and whose features had settled into the complacency of permanent impunity. He saw her. For one moment their eyes met across the corridor, and something moved in his face, not guilt, not shame. Nothing so honest as either of those. Recognition, assessment, the look of a man recalculating. Mara held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds. Then she turned to Pike and said quietly, "I'm ready." The hearing room was smaller than she'd expected. Plain wood, a raised bench for the judge, 2 tables for the opposing parties, a row of chairs along one wall. Judge Calvert Haynes was already seated, a compact man of about 65, with a face made of angles and an expression that gave nothing away and was presumably designed that way. Pike presented first. He was methodical and thorough, and he did not waste a single word, which Marsaw had come to understand was his highest professional quality. He laid out the contract structure, the page 3 clause, the cross-reference to page 6, the 14-year pattern across 6 territories, the identical language in the RC7 reference across all 3 company iterations, and the Nebraska case, which he introduced by name and date and outcome. Then he said, "I would like to call Mara Ellison." She stood up, walked to the front of the room, sat in the chair beside the judge's bench, and placed her hands in her lap. Harmon Vale was on his feet before Pike had asked his first question. "Your Honor," Vale said, with the pleasant manner of a man who was about to say something unpleasant, "before we proceed, I'd like to note for the record that the witness has no legal training, no professional credentials in land or contract law, and is currently employed as a domestic cook and housekeeper. The weight given to her interpretation of complex territorial contracts should reflect those limitations." Haynes looked at Vale. "I'll weigh what I weigh, Counselor." "Sit down." Vale sat. Pike asked his question simply and in order. Timeline of the Nebraska situation, her father's name, the name of the company, the name Calvin Rusk, the specific contract terms as she remembered them, the RC7 language, the drought clause, the renegotiation trigger. Mara answered every question clearly, specifically, and without embellishment. She did not try to sound like a lawyer. She sounded so what she's a woman who had spent 12 years learning something the hard way because the easy version had taken everything from her family and who was now giving that knowledge to a court that could actually use it. When Pike was done, Vale stood up. He was thorough. She had expected that. He questioned her on her educational background, which was incomplete, on her legal training, which was self-directed, on her professional references, which were strong but limited, and then, with the particular pause of a man playing a card he'd been holding since the morning, he said, "Miss Ellison, are you aware that a formal complaint of theft has been filed against you in Broken Spur County?" Was on his feet. "Objection. The complaint is unrelated to these proceedings, and its source is currently under investigation for the very fraud this hearing is addressing." Haynes looked at Vale. "Where are you going with this?" "Your Honor, I'm establishing the witness's credibility and potential motive for—" "She has a motive," Haynes said. "Her father lost his land. That's been stated plainly. Whether that motive makes her testimony more or less credible is for me to determine." He looked at Vale with the specific expression of a man who had seen this particular move before. "Try a different angle." Vale tried several more. None of them landed the way he'd planned, because Mara had nothing to hide and nowhere to go but forward, and a witness with nothing to hide is harder to shake than any other kind. When Vale finally sat down, there was a particular quality to the silence in the room. Mara walked back to her chair. She sat down beside Gideon, and he did something she didn't expect. He put his hand briefly over hers on the armrest. Not a grip, just a contact. 2 seconds. She didn't pull away. Then Judge Haynes leaned forward on his bench, and the room went very quiet. He looked at the documents. He looked at Pike's filing. He looked at Langford, who was sitting very still in his expensive coat. He looked at Rusk, who was no longer looking at Mara, but at the floor in front of his feet. And then Haynes said, in the even, matter-of-fact tone of a man who had made his decision 3 minutes into Pike's presentation and had spent the rest of the time confirming it, "The water filing connected to Black Ridge Ranch is hereby suspended pending full investigation. The Baines and Aldrich agreements are frozen effective immediately. The theft complaint against Miss Ellison, which appears to have been filed within 48 hours of her agreeing to provide testimony in this matter by a complainant whose address cannot be verified, is referred to the Territorial Investigator's Office for review of its origins." He looked at Langford's table. "Gentlemen," he said, "I'd suggest you think carefully about the next step you take." The room exhaled. Outside afterward, in the cold gray light of a Helena November, Pike shook Mara's hand with the formality of a man who was covering for the fact that he was genuinely moved, which she recognized because she was covering for the same thing. Gideon was standing slightly apart, looking at the courthouse steps. Rusk had come out ahead of them and was already moving toward the street, his head down, his briefcase tight against his side. Mara watched him go. She had imagined this moment for 12 years in various forms. She had imagined confronting him. She had imagined saying something to him that would make him understand what he had taken. She had imagined him seeing her face and knowing he had seen her face. She wasn't certain he knew anything at all, but the judge's words were on record now. The freeze was in place. The investigation was open. And Calvin Rusk, for the first time in 14 years, was walking away from a courthouse that hadn't given him what he came for. She stood on the steps in the cold until Gideon came to stand beside her. "Are you all right?" he said. She thought about it honestly. "Not entirely," she said, "but better than I was this morning." He nodded. That's enough for today, it was. It was exactly enough. They rode back to Blackridge as the light failed, and the house was waiting for them with the fire already going. Arlo had stoked it before they left, because that was the kind of thing the ranch hands had started doing without being asked, which was itself a thing that had changed since October and which nobody had remarked on directly. The kitchen was warm. There was food that could be heated. The house made its ordinary sounds around them. Mara stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment before going in. She was not the same person who had arrived 3 weeks ago with one bag and a notice that said honest work only. She wasn't sure what she was yet, but the weight she had carried since she was 17, the specific weight of a wrong she had witnessed and hadn't been able to stop and hadn't been able to answer, had shifted, not gone. She wasn't naive enough to think one hearing changed everything, but shifted in the direction of something that might eventually be called justice. She went inside and started the stove. The collapse didn't happen all at once. It never did with men like Langford. They were built for endurance, for weather and pressure, for finding the next angle when the current one failed. Most of its windows were dark. What happened in the weeks after the Helena hearing was more like watching a structure that had always been hollow finally show its hollowness, not a dramatic fall, but a slow, inevitable settling. Pike rode back to Helena 3 days after the hearing. He didn't tell Gideon everything he was going for, which was unusual for Pike, who was constitutionally opposed to withholding information from clients. But he said only that he had received a communication from the Territorial Investigator's Office and that certain things needed to be followed up in person. He said it in the tone of a man who was being careful, because what he was following up on was delicate, and he didn't want expectations he couldn't yet confirm. He was gone 4 days. During those 4 days, Blackridge ran the way it had been running. Since October, the fires stayed lit. The kitchen produced food at regular intervals. The ranch hands moved through their work with the particular efficiency that came from knowing the household behind them was in order. Walt managed the range. Arlo, whose hand had healed cleanly, had taken on a quiet additional role of checking on the Southwell water table every morning without being asked. Because Mara had mentioned once that it needed watching, and Arlo had apparently decided that meant him. Marfa noticed. She didn't say anything to him about it because she understood that some things functioned better when they weren't remarked on directly. Evelyn was still at Blackridge. She had not left after the hearing as Gideon had expected, and the reason she gave, when he raised it carefully, not wanting to seem like he was asking her to go, was the same one she'd given before. She had practical uses, and she intended to be useful until she wasn't needed anymore. She said it without self-pity and without any of the complicated undercurrents that a lesser woman might have brought to the situation, which made it both easier and harder to respond to. What she was actually doing, Gideon suspected, was making sure the transition she had initiated happened properly, that no one fell through the space her leaving would create. It was a very Evelyn thing to do, and he found it both generous and quietly painful in equal measure. She and Mara had arrived at a working relationship that was cordial without being warm, respectful without being easy. They didn't spend unnecessary time together. But Evelyn had twice in the past week asked Mara specific questions about ranch household management, practical questions, logistical, about supply ordering and seasonal provisioning, and Mara had answered them with the same directness she applied to everything. Of its windows were dark, and both of them had been honest enough not to pretend that those conversations were about anything other than what they were. Evelyn was learning what she would have needed to know if she'd stayed. Mara was passing on what she'd built without being asked to. Neither of them said this aloud. They didn't need to. Pike came back on a Wednesday afternoon with mud on his coat and the specific expression of a man who has found what he was looking for and is still deciding how to feel about the scale of it. He went straight to the study without taking off his coat and spread 3 new documents on Gideon's desk before he'd even sat that down. The territorial investigator, Pike said, has been building a separate case for the past 8 months, completely independent of our petition. They were looking at land filing irregularities across 4 counties and kept hitting the same company names. He pointed at the top document. They had Langford flagged. They had the company structure. What they didn't have was the legal architecture connecting it to the earlier operations in Wyoming and Kansas, because those filings were under different names and the investigators' jurisdiction didn't extend that far back. But we gave them that, Gideon said. Mara gave them that, Pike said. He said it precisely, not to make a point, but because accuracy mattered to him. Her testimony established the Nebraska origins and named Rusk explicitly as the legal author. That gave the investigator the connective tissue he needed to pull the full picture together. He paused. He filed criminal charges against Calvin Rusk this morning. Fraud, conspiracy to defraud, and filing false instruments in multiple territories. Study went quiet. What about Langford? Gideon said. Langford is the harder case. He's careful. Most of what he did was technically legal in isolation. It's the pattern that constitutes the fraud. And proving pattern requires testimony and documentation across multiple jurisdictions. Pike sat down finally, as if the news had used up the energy keeping him upright. The investigator is building it, but Langford knows they're building it. He'll run, probably. Pike didn't seem disturbed by this. There are territorial warrants now, and the investigator has already contacted authorities in Wyoming and Kansas. Wherever Langford goes, he's going somewhere that's been told to expect him. Gideon sat back. Looked at the documents, looked at the window, looked at Pike. The Baines family, he said, the Aldriches. That's the next step. Now that Rusk is charged and the investigator is actively pursuing Langford, the case for avoiding those contracts on grounds of fraud becomes significantly stronger. I'll file by Friday. Pike picked up his pen and looked at it for a moment. I want to be honest with you. It will take time. These things always take time, and they're never as clean as you want them to be. Baines and the Aldriches will have months of uncertainty before their contracts are officially voided. But they should be voided. They will be voided. Should I tell them now? Tell them there's progress. Tell them there's cause for confidence. Don't tell them it's over, because it isn't yet. Gideon rode to the Baines property the following morning. Mr. Baines was 67 years old, a broad, deliberate man who had been ranching the same land since before Montana was a territory. He came to his gate without hurrying and listened to Gideon without interrupting, and when it was done, he was quiet for a long time, looking at the fence line he'd built with his own hands 30 years ago. I knew something was wrong with that contract, he said finally. I asked my nephew to look at it. He said it seemed fine. The clause was designed to seem fine, Gideon said. I'm 67 years old. He said it not with self-pity, but with the flat acknowledgement of a man taking inventory. If I lose this land, if this water situation goes bad during a dry summer, I don't have the years left to build something else. You're not going to lose it, Gideon said. Pike is filing Friday. Baines looked at him. How sure are you? Sure enough to ride over here and tell you in person. The old man was quiet again. Then he nodded once, slowly, the way men his age nodded when they were choosing to believe something, and knew the choosing was as much an act of will as a response to evidence. Tell your housekeeper, Baines said, that she can come to dinner anytime she wants. My wife makes the best roast in this county, and I'd like the chance to say thank you to someone who deserves to hear it. Gideon said he would pass that along. The Aldrich visit was different. Martin Aldrich was 34, young enough to have made the mistake of trusting language he didn't fully understand, and old enough to spend every night since signing the contract lying awake about it. His wife, Clara, was the kind of woman who showed everything on her face without meaning to, and what was on her face when Gideon arrived and she came to the door was the specific expression of a person who has been waiting for news and is afraid to hear it. Their 3 children appeared at various points during the conversation, the oldest a girl of about 8, who stood in the door kitchen, listening with the solemn attention of a child who understood more than the adults wished she did. The youngest, the 4-year-old Gideon, remembered from what Pike had said, sat on Martin's boot during most of the conversation with perfect unconscious trust. Gideon told them what he'd told Baines: progress, grounds for confidence, time required. Clara Aldrich pressed both hands against her mouth when he said the contracts would likely be voided, and what came out of her was not a word, but a sound not quite a sob, something more like the release of something that had been held under pressure for months. We didn't know, Martin said. He'd said it before, probably, to himself and to Clara in the dark. But he said it again, to Gideon. with the particular need of a man who wants someone outside the situation to confirm that ignorance was not the same as stupidity. We read it. We both read it. We didn't. The clause was written to be invisible, Gideon said, and the man who wrote it has been writing it for 14 years. He's had practice. Martin looked at his youngest child, who was now examining Gideon's boot with intense scientific interest. The person who caught it, Martin said, your housekeeper. Is she all right? I heard things in town that didn't sit right with me. She's all right, Gideon said. The complaint against her is under investigation. It won't hold. I'd like to do something for her, Clara said. Her voice was steadier now, the way voices got after releasing what they'd been holding. When this is settled, I don't know what, but something. Tell her yourself, Gideon said. When it's done. He rode back to Blackridge in the late afternoon, and the house was visible from a quarter-mile out, the smoke from the kitchen chimney. The lamp already lit in the main room because the days were getting short. It looked, from that distance, like a house where someone lived, where people came home to. He had not thought about his house from a distance for a long time. For years it had simply been a structure he returned to, because it was where his things were. He thought about what it looked like now. He thought about why. That evening, after supper, Evelyn asked to speak with him privately. They went to the sitting room, which had become the room they used for conversations that needed to happen away from the working parts of the house. She sat across from him in the chair that had been his mother's, and he sat in the one that had been his father's, which struck him as significant in a way he didn't fully work out. I'm leaving Saturday, Evelyn said. The stage to Billings connects to the Chicago line, and I have a cousin there who's been asking me to visit for 2 years. She paused. I think this is the right time. I think you're right, he said. And then, because it was the truth and she deserved it, I'm sorry that what I hoped this would be wasn't what it turned out to be. You don't need to apologize for that, she said. Neither do I. We made a reasonable arrangement based on what we understood at the time. She looked at her hands. We understood changed. Yes, I want to say something else. She looked up. Most of its windows were dark. I know you haven't said anything to her. I know you're waiting for the situation to resolve, or for the right moment, or for whatever it is that men like you wait for when they know what they want and aren't entirely sure they deserve it. It was very still. You do deserve it, Evelyn said. I want you to know that. I think that. Not because I'm trying to be gracious, so I'm past the point where grace requires effort. But because I watched both of you for 3 weeks, and what I saw was 2 people who were better versions of themselves around each other than they probably knew how to be alone. She paused. Don't wait too long. People who've been carrying heavy things for a long time have a tendency to decide they're meant to carry them permanently. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, you're a remarkable person, Evelyn. I know, she said, without false modesty. I just wasn't the right one for this particular situation. She left Saturday morning. Mara helped her with her bags, without being asked, and at the carriage Evelyn turned and put her hand briefly on Mara's arm, not a hug, not a dramatic farewell, just a contact. 3 seconds, woman to woman, carrying something that didn't need translating into words. Mara watched the carriage until it turned out of the drive. Then she went back to the kitchen. The news about Rusk's arrest spread through Broken Spur in the particular way of news that people had been half expecting without knowing they were expecting it fast, and with a quality of satisfaction that was almost embarrassed by itself. Nobody wanted to appear to have been waiting for someone's downfall. But the relief was real. The false theft complaint against Mara was dismissed formally the following Tuesday. The county clerk posted a public notice, which was standard procedure, and which meant that everyone who had heard the accusation in the general store and the feed merchant and the dry goods shop now had an equally public document telling them it had been baseless. Most people in Broken Spur responded to this the way most people respond to being told a rumor was false, with genuine relief mixed with the mild embarrassment of having half believed it in the first place. A few responded with the particular silence of people who had gone further than half believing and didn't know how to address that. The woman who ran the dry goods store came to Blackridge herself. She was a stout, no-nonsense widow named Ruth Callan, who had been in Broken Spur for 20 years and considered herself personally accountable for the moral temperature of the town's retail establishments. She arrived on a Thursday morning, handed Mara a paper-wrapped bundle containing 3 yards of good wool fabric, and said, I'm sorry I didn't push back harder when I heard it. I should have. Mara looked at the fabric, then at Ruth. Did you know me before that accusation came through? Not well. Then you had no reason to push back. You just had reason not to spread it. She paused. Did you spread it? Ruth was quiet for a moment. I may have mentioned it to 2 people. Then this is enough, Mara said, holding up the fabric. Ruth looked at her with the expression of a woman who had expected to be made more uncomfortable and was recalibrating. You're surprisingly not angry. I'm plenty angry, Mara said. I'm just angry at the right people. The week after Rusk's arrest brought something none of them had anticipated: Langford's attempt to run. He was intercepted at the Wyoming border by territorial authorities who had been informed by the Helena investigator's office 2 days before that Langford had drawn significant funds from his Montana accounts. He was brought back to Helena under escort, and the news of this arrived at Blackridge via Pike's rider on a Friday morning, while Mara was in the garden and Gideon was at the fence line, and Walt was the one who found the message. Walt walked to the garden. They got Langford, he said. Mara stopped what she was doing. At the Wyoming border, Walt continued. Pike's rider says he had 2 bags and a bank draft and was heading for the Chicago line. She stood in the garden with cold dirt on her gloves and looked at Walt for a moment. All right, she said. Walt waited, as if expecting something more. Thank you, Walt, she said. He nodded and went back to the yard. She went back to the garden. She was still there when Gideon came back from the fence line an hour later, and Walt told him. He came directly to the garden, still in his work coat, and she looked up when she heard him. Walt told you, he said. Yes. How are you? She thought about it honestly, which was the only way she thought about things. I feel like I'm waiting for something to be real that hasn't been real yet. She pulled a dead root from the soil. I've wanted this for a long time, and now that it's happening, it keeps feeling like I'm going to look up and find out it was different than I thought. He crouched down at the edge of the garden bed. Not to help, he knew better than to come into her work uninvited. Just to be at her level. It's real, he said. I know it is, she said. I just need to catch up to it. He stayed there for a moment. Mara, she looked at him. When this is settled, fully settled, the contract's voided. The case is resolved. I want to talk to you about something. She held his gaze. About what comes next. He paused. For you. Here. Whether that's something you want. Quiet for a moment. Ask me then, she said. When it's settled, all right. But ask me properly, she said. Corner of her mouth moved not quite a smile. I've spent 12 years being careful about what I agree to in writing. He looked at her for a moment, and something in his face shifted, not a dramatic change, just the particular relaxation of a man who has been carrying a question for weeks and has just received enough of an answer to continue. He stood up. I'll ask properly. He went inside. She went back to the garden. The full weight of what Langford's capture meant didn't land until 3 days later, when Pike came out Blackridge in person rather than sending a rider, which meant what he had to say was something he wanted to say face to face. He came in the mid-morning, and they sat in the kitchen, all 3 of them, which was where the real conversations happened. And Pike had apparently figured this out, and he set his leather case on the table and looked at both of them. Langford has decided to cooperate, Pike said. Gideon looked at him. With the investigator, with everyone. His attorney made the arrangement overnight. In exchange for consideration on his own charges, he has provided the full operational history of the scheme, every company name, every territory, every contract variation, every name involved. Pike opened his case. The investigator now has 17 additional families who were defrauded through earlier iterations of this operation. Nebraska, Kansas, Wyoming, Dakota Territory, some of them dating back 12 years. Kitchen was completely quiet. Mara had both hands around her coffee cup and was looking at the table. 12 years, she said, yes. My father was among the first. Almost certainly, Pike said carefully. The Nebraska cases in the early phase of Rusk's operation are in the list. The investigator will be contacting affected families. He paused. There is also the question of your father's specific property. The original fraud that led to the forced sale has now been documented as part of a prosecuted scheme. That creates grounds for a civil action against the estate of the operation. Mara looked up. What does that mean practically, she said. It means a court could rule that the sale of your father's property was fraudulent and that his estate, which means you, as his only surviving family, is entitled to remedy. Pike said it plainly, the way he said everything difficult. The land has passed through innocent hands since then. Can't simply be returned. But financial restitution, representing the property's value and the years of use it generated, is a legitimate claim. He paused. It won't be quick. It will require filing, but I believe it can be won. Mara was very still. My father is dead, she said. Yes, he didn't get to see any of this. No, Pike said. He didn't try to soften it. He didn't. The kitchen fire made its sounds. Somewhere outside, one of the horses shifted in the stable. The ordinary sounds of an ordinary morning sitting alongside something that was not ordinary at all. Gideon was watching Mara, and she knew he was watching her, and she didn't look at him, because if she looked at him right now, she wasn't sure she could maintain the composure she was working hard to maintain. File it, she said to Pike. Her voice was steady. File the claim. I will, Pike said. I'll need a few things from you, letters, records, whatever you have from that time. I have letters, she said. I kept everything. Pike nodded. Of course you did. She looked at him sharply, at that look that might have been the beginning of tears or the beginning of a laugh, and it landed somewhere in between, which was perhaps the most honest place for it to land. The days that followed were quieter than she expected. The noise of the previous weeks, the letters, the writers, the hearing, the accusation, the arrest, capture had created a kind of sustained alertness that she had been living inside for so long she'd stopped noticing it as a state and had started thinking of it as simply how things were. And then Langford was in custody, and Lamslam Sheffield and the investigator was working, and there was suddenly nothing urgent to respond to. She kept working. That was what she knew how to do, and it was what the ranch needed, and it was honest labor, which had always been its own form of answer to things she couldn't resolve any other way. She made meals. She managed the pantry supply before the serious winter set in. She organized the cellar stores with Walt's help, which involved a long morning of cataloging that was tedious and necessary and satisfying in the specific way of tasks that have a clear end state you can point to when you're done. She wrote to Hector Baines's wife, accepting the dinner invitation. She thought about Clara Aldrich and the 4-year-old on Martin's boot and the 8-year-old listening from the kitchen doorway with 2 old eyes. She thought about her father. Samuel Ellison had been a stubborn, quiet man who loved his land with the specific devotion of someone who had worked too hard for something to be casual about it. He had not been a warm father in the conventional sense. He was not a man who said things directly, but he had shown her how to read the sky for weather and how to tell healthy soil from dead soil and how to make a decision without waiting for someone to make it for you. Those were the things she carried from him, the useful things. She had not been able to save his farm. She had not been able to give him back what was taken. But she had, in the end, found the people who took it and stood in a courtroom and told a judge exactly what they were. He would not have said he was proud of her. He would have nodded once, the way Hector Baines had nodded, and gone back to work, and that would have been everything. She was in the kitchen on a quiet Thursday morning, 14 days after Langford's capture, when Gideon came in. He was clean, not in work clothes, but in the clothes he wore when he went into town or met with Pike, which meant he'd made a deliberate choice about what the morning was going to be. He was carrying something, which she noticed only after she'd registered the clothes. Folded piece of paper. He set it on the tableson beside her coffee cup. You said to ask properly, he said. She looked at the paper, then at him. You wrote it down, she said. I've been writing it for 2 weeks. That's the 4th version. She picked it up, unfolded it. She read every word. He stood across the kitchen and didn't move, and didn't say anything, which took more stillness than most things he'd done in his life. And he was aware of that fact in a specific, physical way. The letter was not short. It was not flowery. It was Gideon Mercer's voice in writing direct and deliberate, with the occasional stumble of a man who was saying something true for the first time, and not entirely sure where the true parts ended, and the wanting to be true parts began. He said what he had watched her do to his house and to his ranch and to himself over the previous weeks. He said he wasn't asking her to stay because she was useful, which she was, but because the kind of person she was had changed the way he moved through the days in a way that was not reversible, and he didn't want it to be reversible. He said he understood if she needed more time or more certainty or something he didn't yet know how to offer. He said he would wait. He said, please. Mara read it twice. Then she set it down on the table and looked at it for a moment. The 4th version, she said, yes. What happened to the first 3? Too long, he said, then too short. Then I said something about the water table, which was accurate but not what I meant. She looked at him. He looked back. Yes, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Yes to all of it, she said. Yes to staying. Yes to what you meant and what you didn't say quite right, and yes to the water table, which I've also been thinking about. She paused. He crossed the kitchen. He didn't say anything else, and she didn't either because there wasn't anything that needed saying, and both of them had spent enough of their lives saying things that didn't need to be said to waste the moment on more of them. Kitchen fire was going. The coffee was still warm. Outside, the first real snow of the winter was beginning, not the tentative early season dusting, but the real thing, heavy and settling, covering the 7,000 acres of Blackridge Ranch in white that would stay. Inside, the house that had once felt like a structure a man returned to, because his things were there, felt, for the first time in 6 years, like something with a different name entirely. Walt came in from the yard 20 minutes later. And stomping snow off his boots and stopped in the kitchen doorway when he registered what he was looking at. He looked at Gideon, looked at Mara, turned around and went back out. "I need to check on the horses," Walt said from the other side of the door in the voice of a man who absolutely did not need to check on the horses. "They'll need water before this snow gets serious." Mara pressed her lips together. "Walt," she said. A pause. "Ma'am, the horses were watered an hour ago." Another pause, longer this time. "Could do with a second watering," he said. "Cold weather. They dry out." She looked at Gideon. He was, for the first time in as long as either of them could remember, laughing. Not the polite, managed version men like him used in company. Actually laughing, the kind that came from somewhere that didn't get used enough and was a little rusty from disuse, which made it better rather than worse. Mara watched him for a moment. Then she laughed too. Outside, Walt walked back to the stable with the deliberate pace of a man who had given people a gift they didn't know they needed and was not going to cheapen it by acknowledging it. The snow kept coming, the fire kept burning, and in the kitchen of Blackridge Ranch, on a Thursday morning in December of 1882, two people who had both survived things that should have made them smaller stood in the warmth they'd built together and chose each other, imperfectly and without ceremony, the way all real choices are made. The snow that had started on that Thursday morning didn't stop for 3 days. By the time it did, Blackridge Ranch had disappeared under 18 inches of white that softened every hard edge and muffled every sound and made the world outside the windows look like something that existed separately from the ordinary business of living. Cattle were in the lower pasture where the wind broke against the ridge. The horses were stabled and watered, despite Walt's earlier claims about their requirements. Kitchen fire had not gone out once. Inside, things had shifted in the way that things shift when a decision has been made, and both people making it know it's real, not dramatically, not with any sudden change in the texture of daily life, but with the particular ease of two people who have stopped performing casualness at each other and can simply be in the same room without it costing anything. Gideon still felt, occasionally, the specific awkwardness of a man who had lived alone for 6 years and had forgotten some of the smaller graces of shared living. He left his account books spread across the dining table one evening without thinking, and then remembered, mid-stride back from the study, that the dining table was now actually used for dining, and came back to collect them with a feeling he couldn't quite name, that was adjacent to embarrassment but warmer. Mara found him doing it and said nothing except, "There's space on the sideboard." "Right," he said. "Or the study. I know. I'm not asking you to be different than you are," she said. "I'm just telling you where else things can go." He looked at her. She went back to whatever she'd been doing. He moved the books to the sideboard. That was how they handled most things. Not dramatically. Not with speeches. With the small, specific adjustments of two people learning each other's edges without making the edges into problems. Walt pretended not to notice any of it, which was his gift to them both. Arlo noticed all of it and told the other net hands, which spread through the bunkhouse in a way that was apparently net positive, based on the observable fact that the men started being more careful about tracking mud through the kitchen door. The legal machinery, meanwhile, moved at its own pace, which was slower than anyone wanted and faster than it had any right to be given the scale of what it was trying to untangle. Calvin Rusk's criminal case went to a territorial grand jury in January. Pike rode to Helena for the proceedings and came back with the news that the jury had returned a true bill on all counts, fraud, conspiracy, and filing false instruments across multiple territories. Rusk's attorney had attempted to argue that his client was a legal consultant who had no operational role in how the contracts were used, which was the kind of argument that sounded reasonable until you looked at 14 years of evidence and the fact that the language was identical across every company iteration because Rusk had written it every single time. The jury had looked at the evidence. They had not found the argument convincing. Rusk was held pending trial, which was scheduled for the spring. He would not be running anywhere. Victor Langford's cooperation had been more complicated, as cooperation from men like Langford always was. He gave information incrementally, testing each disclosure to see what it bought him, trying to calculate how much he could trade without losing more than he gained. Territorial investigator, a methodical man named Connors, who had the patience of someone who had done this for 30 years and understood that complicated men were still just men, let Langford do his calculations and took what was offered and waited for the next piece. What Langford ultimately gave them was a full accounting names, dates, contract numbers, bank transfers that exposed the operation's entire history back to its origins in Kansas in 1869, 13 years. More than 30 families across 6 territories who had been stripped of water rights, grazing access, or land itself through variations of the same mechanism. When Pike brought this number to Blackridge, he set it on the kitchen table and said it plainly without preparation or softening, because in his experience, softening large numbers just made them take longer to absorb without making them any smaller. 30 families. Mara looked at the number for a long time. How many of them know yet? She said. The investigator's office is in the process of notifying all identified parties, Pike said. It will take weeks. Some of the earlier cases are in territories where finding the original requires searching records that weren't well kept. Some of them may be dead, she said. Some of them, yes. She nodded thinly. Children, in those cases, yes. She was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at Gideon. Then back at Pike. The restitution claim for my father's property, she said. Where does that stand? The court accepted the filing, Pike said. Based on Langford's full cooperation and the documented history, the judge has confirmed that the Nebraska transaction was fraudulent. The land itself, he paused briefly, the land was resold twice after your father lost it. The current owners are innocent parties. They cannot and will not be displaced. I know that, she said. She had known it from the beginning. Farm was not coming back. That wasn't the point. That had never been the point. The court has assessed restitution based on the property's value at time of fraudulent loss adjusted for 12 years of productive use, Pike continued. The figure represents what your father would have had if the contract had never been signed. He named the amount. Kitchen was quiet. It was not a fortune by the standards of men like Langford or Gideon, but it was by the standards of a woman who had been carrying one bag between households for 12 years, a significant sum. Mara looked at the table. She had her hands around her coffee cup, and she was looking at the number Pike had written on the paper in front of her. It won't make him not dead, she said. No, Pike said. It won't. It won't give him back the years he lost after. She wasn't being morbid. She was being precise, the way she always was. What it does is confirm that what was done to him was wrong. Officially, on the record. Yes, Pike said. That's exactly what it does. She picked up the paper, set it down again. I've been thinking about what to do with it. Both men waited. There are 30 families, she said, or their heirs. And there are going to be more families, not these 30, but families like them. The method Rusk used may be prosecuted, but the general shape of it, complex contracts, vulnerable people, clauses designed to look like administrative language that's not going away. Men like Rusk don't disappear when one Rusk goes to prison. They're replaced. Gideon was watching her. He had not said anything since Pike had started, because he had learned that Mara thought out loud in specific circumstances, and that the best thing to do in those circumstances was leave the air available. There needs to be someone who reads the papers before families sign them, she said. Not after. Not when it's already too late, and the drought has come, and the water's been shut off. Before she looked at Pike. Is there any mechanism for that? Legally. Pike studied her. There are legal aid organizations in larger cities. Nothing formal in the territories for rural land matters specifically. Could there be? Something would have to fund it. I know, she said. I'm asking if it's possible. With adequate funding and the right person to lead it? Pike said. Yes. A fund that offered consultation to homesteaders and small ranchers before they signed land or water agreements that's possible. It wouldn't be free. Someone would have to administer it, build relationships with territorial attorneys who'd agree to participate, establish a process. Who would you recommend to lead it? She said. Pike was quiet for a moment. There's a young attorney in Helena, he said carefully. Lydia Fenwick. She's been practicing for 3 years. Exceptional mind for contract law, better than exceptional. She's been struggling to build a practice. He stopped briefly, because the profession is not especially welcoming to her. Because she's a woman, Mara said. Yes. Then she spent 3 years being told her abilities don't count as abilities, Mara said. It means she's had to learn twice as much to be taken half as seriously. A pause. Send her his letter. Tell her I'd like to meet with her. Pike looked at her for a long moment. Then he did something Mara had never seen him do in their months off working together. He smiled a real one. Not the professional almost smile he used in hearings, but the genuine expression of a man who was unexpectedly moved. I'll write it tonight, he said. The first week of February brought 2 things simultaneously, which was the way important things tended to arrive, never spaced out considerately, always in pairs, as if the world wanted to see how you handled more than one thing at once. The first thing was Lydia Fenwick. I arrived at Blackridge on a Tuesday, having ridden from Helena in winter conditions that made the trip inadvisable, which told Mara something about her before she'd said a word. She was 27, small and dark-haired, and precise in her movements, with the slightly rigid posture of a person who had spent years making herself take up exactly the amount of space she was entitled to, and not 1 inch more, because 1 inch more had always been contested. She came in, accepted coffee, sat down at the kitchen table, and looked at Mara directly. Mr. Pike told me about your father, she said. Not as an opening gambit, not as flattery. Just a statement of what she knew and thought was relevant. Did he tell you what I want to do? Mara said. He told me the shape of it. I want to hear it from you, Mara told her. Not just the fund, but the reasoning, the clause on page 3, the RC7 language, the gap between what documents said and what most people understood documents to mean. The specific type of vulnerability that Rusk had exploited, which was not stupidity and not carelessness, but simply the absence of someone in the room who could translate what was written into what it actually meant. Lydia listened without interrupting. When Mara was done, she was quiet for a moment. The challenge, Lydia said, is reach. A fund in Helena helps Helena. Homesteaders in the eastern ranges. Smaller operations near the territorial boundaries, they won't come to Helena because they can't afford the trip. The consultation has to go to them. I know, Mara said. What would that require? Relationships with attorneys in multiple locations who agree to participate in exchange for a fee from the fund rather than from the clients. A process for submitting documents by mail, if necessary, that allows review before signing. Clear criteria for which cases qualify. Lydia paused. And enough initial funding to establish it before it's expected to be self-sustaining, because these things don't sustain themselves immediately. The restitution is enough to start it, Mara said. I've worked out the numbers. She set a paper on the table. Look at this and tell me if I'm wrong. Lydia looked at it. Went through it carefully, the way a precise person went through numbers, not just accepting them, but checking the logic. Then she looked up. You're not wrong, she said. It's tight in the second year if participation is low. But if Pike recruits even 3 participating attorneys in the first 6 months, he'll recruit 5, Mara said. I'll ask him to. Lydia looked at her steadily. You'd be giving away money you're entitled to keep. Money that came from what happened to your family. I know what it came from, Mara said. I'm not questioning the decision, Lydia said. I'm making sure you've heard yourself say it out loud to another person. Mara looked at her, decided she liked her. I've heard myself, she said. Lydia picked up the paper again. Then I'll do it, she said. I'll lead it. They shook hands across the kitchen table, and the Ellisons' Homestead Legal Fund, which was what they decided to call it after a conversation that took longer than the decision itself, was established on a Tuesday in February, in the kitchen of Blackridge Ranch, without ceremony and without anyone present except the 2 women who were going to build it and the coffee that was going cold between them. Gideon, when Mara told him, was quiet for a moment. That's the whole sum, he said. Most of it. Mara, don't, she said, not sharply, just firmly. I wasn't going to tell you not to, he said. I was going to say that I want to contribute to it. She looked at him. Not all of it, he said. I'm not taking this over. It's yours. But I have money, and I have standing in this territory, and both of those things can be useful to what you're trying to build. She thought about it. You'd have to let Lydia run it without interference. I have no desire to run a legal assistance fund, he said. I have cattle. Then yes, she said, Your name on the founding documentation would help, and a contribution to the second-year funding would address the tight spot in my projections." "Done," he said. "You didn't ask what the tight spot was. You said it was in the second year. I trust your projections." He paused. "Mara, I trust your projections." She looked at him for a moment. Something in his face was open in a way that it hadn't been when she'd arrived in October, not a different person, but the same person with less space between who he was and what he showed. She had watched this happen gradually and hadn't remarked on it because it was his, not hers to name. The trial of Calvin Rusk took place in March. Mara did not attend every session. She attended 3 the opening, the day her own testimony about the Nebraska fraud was entered as evidence of the pattern's origins, and the verdict. The courthouse in Helena was warmer by March than it had been in November, which shouldn't have mattered but did in the small way that physical comfort affects the ability to sit through difficult things. She sat in the gallery rather than at Pike's table on the days she wasn't testifying, and she sat straight, and she kept her hands in her lap, and she watched. Rusk's attorney was competent. He had to work with what he had, which was an argument that the contracts were legal instruments that reflected standard territorial practice and that any misunderstanding of their terms was the responsibility of the parties who signed them. He to the sex. He said this with the professional conviction of a man who had been paid to believe it, and it landed in the courtroom with the particular hollowness of an argument that was technically structured but morally empty. The jury had the evidence that the investigator and Pike had built over months. They had Langford's cooperation, which had been comprehensive enough to be convincing without again sympathetic. They had 32 families documented. They had the original Nebraska case, which had now been formally established as the operation's origin point, and which had Mara's testimony attached to it, her age at the time, her father's name, the specific contract language, the progression from signing to loss. They deliberated for 6 hours. Mara was in the courthouse corridor when the jury came back, sitting on a wooden bench with Pike beside her and Gideon on the other side. The corridor was cold and smelled like old wood and wet wool from people's coats. Someone had a pocket watch that ticked audibly. She focused on that sound for most of the waiting because it was regular, and she needed something regular. When the clerk came out and said the jury had returned, she stood up. She stood in the gallery when the verdict was read. She stood straight, which cost something by that point in the day, but she did it anyway because she had been 17 years old in a Nebraska farmhouse when Calvin Rusk had taken everything her father had, and she had not been standing straight. Then she had been sitting on the floor of an empty room, leaning against a wall, not knowing yet what standing back up was going to take. She knew now. The verdict was guilty on all counts. Rusk received 12 years in the territorial prison, the maximum available under current statutes. His attorney was already preparing an appeal, which Pike told her would likely fail, given the weight of the evidentiary record, though he said it carefully, as he said all things about future court actions, because certainty about appeals was a thing no honest attorney offered. Mara listened to the sentence, watched Rusk's face when it was read. He didn't look at her. She hadn't expected him to. Men like Rusk didn't look at the people they'd harmed. They looked at the people who still had power over them, the judge, the jury, the bailiff. She was none of those things to him. She was just this obstacle that had turned out to be larger than he'd calculated. She was all right with that. Outside the courthouse, Pike shook her hand and held it for a moment. 12 years ago, he said, a 17-year-old girl watched her father's farm disappear into a fraudulent contract and couldn't stop it. Don't make it too neat, she said. He still died. I know he did, Pike said. I'm not making it neat. I'm saying that what you built from that, what you carried and learned and did with it, matters. It mattered to Baines and the Aldriches and 30 other families, some of whom you'll never meet. He paused. I've been practicing law for 38 years. I haven't seen many people do what you did. She looked at him. You did most of it. I did the legal work, he said. You did the harder part. You came forward when it would have been reasonable not to. She didn't answer that. Some things were true enough that arguing with them was just noise. Gideon was standing at the bottom of the courthouse steps, waiting. He'd been in the gallery, too, on the other side of the room, because there hadn't been adjacent seats when the gallery filled up, and she had been aware of his presence the entire time in the specific way you became aware of someone who had become part of how you oriented yourself in unfamiliar spaces. She came down the steps. He looked at her face, assessing, the way he'd looked at everything since she'd known him directly, and without fuss. All right, he said. She thought about it honestly, which was the only way she knew how. Getting there, she said. He nodded. That's enough. They rode back to Blackridge together, just the two of them, because Walt had come in his own wagon and had left ahead of them with the particular tact he'd deployed consistently and without comment. The road back was muddy with the first edge of spring thaw, and the horses were careful, and neither of them spoke much for the first hour, because there wasn't anything that needed saying yet, and they had both learned to recognize the difference between silence that was empty and silence that was full. At some point in the second hour, when the outline of the ranch was beginning to appear in the distance, Gideon said, I was thinking about the south pasture fence. She looked at him, the eastern boundary line, the section that was tampered with. He kept his eyes on the road. I want to walk it properly in the spring. Reset the posts that were moved. Have the survey markers reconfirmed. That's a good idea, she said. I was thinking you'd want to come. She looked at him again. He was watching the road with the expression of a man mentioning something practical. You want me to walk the fence line, she said. You noticed the fence before I did, he said. And you've been reading this ranch's problems for 6 months. It would be useful. Useful, she said. And he said, I'd like the company. She looked at the road ahead. At the ranch appearing in the distance, the smoke from the kitchen chimney where Arlo had been asked to keep the fire going. The house that had once been a structure and was now something with a warmer name. I'll come, she said. They were married in April. Not a ceremony with a church and a crowd and a reception that people would describe for years afterward. They had discussed it briefly, practically, in the kitchen one morning, and had arrived at the same conclusion independently. Neither of them was the kind of person who wanted the occasion to be about the occasion. What they wanted was for it to be real, which it could be with 2 witnesses and a justice of the peace and the fireplace Mara had brought back to life. Walt was a witness. Lydia Fenwick, who had been in and out of Blackridge regularly since February as the fund's operational structure was built, was the other. Arlo had been told there would be a good meal involved, which was sufficient to ensure his complete cooperation with whatever the morning required. Pike did not attend because Pike was not that kind of attorney, and also because he had a case and Helena and Mara had told him firmly that the timing was not going to change on his account, which he'd accepted with the specific expression of a man who was secretly relieved not to have to manage his emotions in a public setting. He sent a letter. It said, I have reviewed the terms of this arrangement and find them sound. Proceed. Mara read it at breakfast and laughed for almost 30 seconds, which was the longest she'd laughed at a single thing in recent memory, which Gideon noted with the private satisfaction of a man who had become invested in that particular sound. The ceremony itself was short. The justice of the peace was a man named Bertram Hoole, who had married approximately 200 couples in the territory over 20 years and had the professional ease of someone who understood that the legal portion of the event was not the important portion and got through it efficiently on everyone's behalf. What Mara remembered afterward was not the words she remembered those two, but they were simple, and simplicity didn't fix itself in memory the way complexity did. What she remembered was the fireplace behind them, which she had cleaned and reset and stacked the first week she'd arrived, and which had been burning ever since. And the way Gideon held her hand, not dramatically, not as a gesture, but with the particular grip of a man who had decided something and wasn't uncertain about it. She was not uncertain either. She had never been uncertain, which had sometimes been her greatest strength, and sometimes thing that made her hardest to be around. She had come to Blackridge to do honest work. She had done it. What it had turned into was not what she'd planned for, but she had learned slowly, and not without difficulty, that the things you planned for were rarely the things worth keeping. Walt shook Gideon's hand for a long time. Then he looked at Mara and said, I've been with this ranch for 22 years. I've never seen him eat a proper meal every morning before you came. Walt, Gideon said. I'm complimenting the cooking, Walt said. Can't a man compliment the cooking? You're not, Gideon said. I also think you're good for him otherwise, Walt said to Mara, with the dignity of a man who had decided to say the thing directly and was not going to be talked out of it. That needed saying. It didn't, Mara said, but thank you. He nodded once, went back to his post by the door, hands behind his back, looking at the wall with the contentment of a man who had discharged a responsibility. Lydia stayed for the meal. She and Mara had developed the particular friendship of 2 women who had recognized something in each other, not a similarity of background or temperament, but a similarity of position. Both of them knew what it was to do work that was consistently underestimated by the people who were supposed to be taking it seriously. And both of them had developed, in response, the same slightly dry humor that comes from spending too much time being the most capable person in a room that doesn't fully know it. The fund's first formal intake is scheduled for next month. Lydia told her over dinner. 3 families in the Western County. A widow with a grazing agreement that needs review. A young homesteader who was approached by someone using almost the exact same drought clause structure. Mara looked up. The same structure. Similar. Different company, different name, different attorney. The artsy 7 language is there. Lydia's face was the particular expression of a woman who was angry and had turned the anger into something with edges. They're not gone. Rusk's in prison and Langford's cooperating, and there are still people using variations of the same tool. I know, Mara said. That's why the fund exists. The widow has no money for consultation, Lydia said. She has 3 acres and a water right, and she was 10 minutes from signing. That's exactly who it's for, Mara said. What happened? Her neighbor told her to wait. Said he'd heard there might be someone who could look at it first. Lydia paused. Her neighbor is Hector Baines. The table was quiet for a moment. Mara thought about the old rancher, the 67-year-old man standing at his fence line saying, I knew something was wrong, and I didn't know what. The nod he'd given when Gideon told him the contracts would be voided. The way he'd said, tell your housekeeper she can come to dinner, anytime. He had passed it on, without being organized, without being asked, without being part of any structure or fund or formal network. He had simply told his neighbor, wait, there's someone who might be able to help. That was how it worked. That was how it had always worked, when it worked at all. Not through institutions first, but through people, through the specific, ordinary human act of one person saying to another, I learned something the hard way, and I don't want you to learn it the same way. She sat at the table in her own kitchen on the evening of her wedding day, with the fire going and the snow long gone, and the first real warmth of spring coming through the window that had been cracked an inch, and she thought about her father. Samuel Ellison had not been a man who said things directly. He had shown her how to read the sky and the soil and how to make a decision without waiting for permission. He had not been able to protect himself from what Rusk had done, and she had not been able to protect him, and he had not recovered from the loss. She had spent 12 years carrying that, not as guilt, exactly, she had worked past guilt, but as a kind of unfinished sentence, as something that had been broken and not repaired. The restitution money was now a fund. The fund was operational. Lydia Fenwick had 3 families scheduled for next month. Hector Baines had told his neighbor to wait. The sentence wasn't finished. Sentences like that one never fully finished. But it had moved forward in a way it hadn't been able to for 12 years, and the difference between an unfinished sentence moving forward and an unfinished sentence sitting still was not a small thing. It was, in fact, the only thing. Later that night, after Lydia had ridden back to town, and Walt had gone to the bunkhouse, and Arlo had eaten enough for 3 men and gone to bed satisfied, Gideon came and sat beside her in the main room where the fire was still going. They didn't say much net. She had her feet tucked under her on the settee that had been moved 6 inches from the wall in October and had not moved back, and he was in the chair that had been his father's, and the fire made its ordinary sounds. And outside the Montana spring night was cold but not cruel. I've been thinking, she said. About what? About the fence line. The spring walk you mentioned. What about it? I want to start from the eastern boundary, she said. Section that was tampered with. I want to see it reset properly. He looked at her. It matters to me, she said, the boundary being where it's supposed to be, the markers being accurate, not because of Langford anymore. She paused. Just because things should be where they're supposed to be. All right, he said, eastern boundary first. And I want to check the south well while we're at it. The water table. It's been rising since March. I think we're past the seasonal concern, but I want to document it properly. She looked at him. He was quiet for a moment, the way he got when something struck him, in a place he didn't immediately know how to name. She had come to recognize this quality in him, this stillness that wasn't absence but presence, the particular attention of a man who was actually listening. You're going to keep noticing things, he said. I'm not going to stop, she agreed. I know. He looked at the fire. I'm counting on it. The spring came properly the second week of April, the way Montana spring came, not gently, not gradually, but with the sudden decisiveness of a season that had been held back long enough and was done waiting. Snow went fast. The ground came up wet and dark and ready. Cattle moved back to the upper pasture. The garden, which had been replanted in October and had overwintered better than anyone expected, began showing the first green that wasn't an accident. Mara walked the eastern fence line with Gideon on a Saturday morning in late April. They started at the boundary marker and moved west along the tampered section, and she watched him reset each post that had been shifted not dramatically, not by much, just the few inches that were the difference between where the boundary was and where someone had wanted it to appear to be. She held the measuring string. She had done this before. She realized held one end of a measuring string while her father did something on the other end, something practical on the Nebraska farm. She had been small. She had not known yet what the farm would become and lose. She had just held the string and watched him work and thought about other things, the way children do. She held the string now and watched Gideon work and didn't think about other things. She was here. This was the string she was holding. This was the boundary being set back, where it belonged. That was enough. It was in fact more than enough. It was the kind of mourning that didn't announce itself as significant, but which she knew, with the specific instinct of someone who had learned to recognize what things cost and what they were worth, she would remember for a long time. By noon they had walked the full section. The markers were reset. The measurements were documented in the notebook Mara had brought in her own handwriting, with the date. They stood at the western end of the tampered section and looked back at what they'd done. Good, Gideon said. Good, she agreed. They walked back to the house for lunch, and Walt had coffee ready, which he had not been asked to do, and which he presented without comment in the manner of a man whose opinion about the morning was contained entirely in the gesture. The Ellison Homestead Legal Fund opened formally in May. Lydia Fenwick held the first consultation sessions in a rented room in Helena and 2 additional locations in the western counties, reached by arrangement with a circuit attorney who had agreed to participate after a letter from Pike that contained, by Mara's later estimation, the most diplomatically aggressive language she had ever seen assembles in a single full paragraph. The widow with the grazing agreement did not sign the document she had been presented with. The homesteader with the drought clause variant brought his document to Lydia, who identified 3 separate points of concern and wrote a clear explanation of each one in language the man could read to his wife that evening at their kitchen table. Both families kept their land. That summer the fund received 11 inquiries. Lydia reviewed 8 documents personally and referred 3 to participating attorneys. Of the 8 she reviewed directly, 7 contained clauses or terms she flagged as concerning. 5 of those 7 families declined to sign the original documents and negotiated modifications. Mara read Lydia's monthly reports at the kitchen table and kept her own notes alongside them, tracking which types of clauses appeared most frequently, which patterns recurred, which arguments the presenting parties used most often when the concerning language was flagged. She was building a record, not for any immediate purpose. Just because records were how you knew what you were dealing with, and she had learned early and permanently that the cost of not knowing was higher than the cost of keeping track. Gideon saw her, working at the table one evening, and said nothing, just set a fresh cup of coffee beside her, and went back to his account books, which were now on the sideboard where they belonged. The Baines family came to dinner in June, as Ruth Baines had suggested, and Hector had arranged. It was a warm evening, and they ate outside, which was a thing the Baines family apparently did in summer, regardless of how many people were at the table. And the table was full the Baines family, including 2 grown children who had come in from their own claims, and Gideon and Mara and Walt, who had been included without discussion because Walt had become the kind of presence that was simply part of what Blackridge was. Hector Baines sat across from Mara and ate steadily and said, at one point during the meal, without looking up from his plate, heard from Martin Aldrich. His water contract was voided formal last month. He's putting in a new fence on the eastern line. I heard, Mara said. His youngest started walking. Hector said, gets into everything. They do that, Mara said. Hector looked up. Aldrich wants to name the boy's second name after your father. That's all right. Mara was very still. He said the fund kept the land the boy's going to grow up on, Hector said. He wanted to say thank you in a way that would last longer than a letter. She looked at the old rancher. at his weathered face and steady eyes and the particular dignity of a man who had nearly lost what he'd built and had decided, in response, to make sure other people didn't. "It's all right," she said. "Tell him it's all right." Hector nodded once and went back to his plate. Later, walking back to Blackridge in the long June evening light, Mara was quiet in the way that meant she was somewhere she needed to be for a while. Gideon walked beside her and didn't press. After a while, she said, "Samuel." "What? The Aldrich boy's name. His middle name." She paused. "Samuel, your father's name?" "Yes." The road back to Blackridge was soft with summer dust. The light was going golden and long across the range, the kind of light that made everything look like it was lit from inside rather than from above. "He would have hated this," Mara said. "The attention. The significance of it." "I know," Gideon said. He did know, in the way you came to know, the outlines of someone through what the person they'd shaped told you about them. "He would have said it was the land that mattered," she said, "not the name." "He would have been right," Gideon said, "and wrong." She looked at him. "The land matters," he said, "and the name matters. Both things are true." She was quiet for a moment. Then she took his hand, which was not something she did often in open spaces, because she had not spent her life in the habit of gestures like that, and old habits of self-sufficiency didn't dissolve just because you had chosen to share your life with someone. They went slowly, the way all honest things went slowly. But she took his hand. They walked the rest of the way back to Blackridge like that, through the June evening, across the ground that had been walked and fought for, and measured and reset, toward the house with the fire that had not gone cold since October, the house that had once forgotten how to live. Gideon had built an empire with his hands and his father's stubbornness and a grief that had driven him forward for 6 years. Mara had survived 12 years carrying knowledge that nobody had wanted and a loss that nobody had answered for. Together they had built something that was harder to name than an empire and worth more than anything in either of their account books. It wasn't perfect. It was never going to be perfect. He still left papers on the wrong table sometimes. She still went silent in ways that required patience to sit beside. There were mornings when the weight of what she'd carried showed in her face before she'd had her coffee. And there were evenings when his instinct to solve things ran up against her instinct to carry things alone, and they had to find the middle ground, the way you always found middle ground, not gracefully, but honestly, and without walking away from it. But the fire stayed lit, the table stayed full, the garden kept growing. And in the Eastern Territories, in the homesteads and small ranches where people were living the particular precarious life of people who had built something on land they didn't fully understand how to protect, there was now a name you could ask about. The Ellison Fund. Someone who read the papers before you signed. Someone who understood what the clauses meant. Someone who was there before the drought came and the water stopped, and the thing you'd built that disappeared into language you hadn't known how to read. Mara had not saved her father's farm. She had not been able to give him back what was taken, or the years that went after it. That was the part that didn't resolve, that lived in the permanent past tense, where losses live, unchanged and unchallengeable. But she had taken what that loss had made her careful, precise, relentless, carrying knowledge like a tool she'd sharpened for 12 years, and she had aimed it at the right target. And somewhere in the territory, in a house she would never visit, a boy named with her father's name was learning to walk on land that nobody could take from him. That was not the same as justice, but it was the closest thing to it that the real world offered. And in the kitchen of Blackridge Ranch, with the fire going, and the coffee on, and the account books in their proper place, and the garden doing what gardens did when someone paid attention to them, Mara Ellison Mercer sat down at the table she had first arrived at as a stranger and picked up her pen and kept working, as she always had, as she intended to,